BEworks is honored to have this year's summit hosted by Tony Chapman. Tony is an inductee into the Marketing Hall of Legends and the Canadian Advertising Hall of Fame. It's a testament to a career where he built 2 communications agencies and a research firm. For the past decade, Tony has hosted and spoken at conferences all over the world while launching a national radio program and podcast called Chatter That Matters, a show about ordinary people who do extraordinary things. Please welcome Tony Chapman.
And I'm going to be the host of the BEworks Shaping the Future Summit. I have to warn you, we're going on a 4-hour quest. And we're going to be covering territory that's not a skip in the park. We're going to be looking at the future of cities. We're going to talk about massive problems like how do we mitigate this food waste. We're going to be even looking at things like market research and some of the paradigms that are shifting because of what we can find out with the rigor of scientific process and the magic of behavioral economics. There's a common denominator, it's the human being. How they think, how they feel, and how they behave. And we're dealing with forces of change that are rendering so much of what we know obsolete, pushing us back on our back heels. And what today's about is to start a movement. First up is going to be Kelly Peters. She's the founder and CEO of BEworks. This is her brain trust. And when I was talking to her about this event, saying, what are you hoping for? And she used that word movement. She said, we've got to make some big changes as a society. Sometimes those changes are just going after market share. We'll hear about that today, but they're also about really solving some of the biggest problems that we're facing. And her opening talk, she's going to shoulder a lot of weight because she's going to talk about those forces of change. Then afterwards, she's going to talk about the silver lining in that dark cloud, that you can use scientific process, you can use behavioral economics, that you can find a way to turn uncertainty to certainty. Let's introduce Kelly Peters.
It is my pleasure to introduce to you our keynote speaker, Kelly Peters. As many of you know, Kelly is the CEO and co-founder of BEworks. In her talk, Kelly's going to explain how behavioral science can be used to help companies find purpose and realize the goals of stakeholder capitalism. She will highlight one of the biggest opportunities to realize the potential of stakeholder capitalism, and that's consumer behavior. Companies can change their products, innovate their process, and adopt UN sustainability goals, but when consumers change their behavior, the impact will be huge. Kelly's a world-renowned expert in behavioral science and is passionate about bringing scientific thinking to business strategy, marketing, and operations. She advises Fortune 500 leaders on how to drive innovation through behavioral insights and the application of scientific thinking to strategy. Her BEworks method has been fully and successfully implemented across a multitude of industries, including healthcare, financial services, media and publishing, utilities, and government. And after Kelly's keynote, we sit down for a fireside chat.
Hello, and thank you so much for joining us at BEworks Summit. This conference is all about shaping the future, about how we can address the challenges coming our way by harnessing the power of behavioral science. I chose this theme because we need to start making fundamental changes. We're facing substantial challenges right now, including climate change, starvation and malnourishment among some populations, while others grapple with industrial-scale food waste. We're combating violence, not just from members within our society, but even from the police forces that are intended to protect us. We're grappling with a housing crisis where the dream of home ownership is out of the reach of most people. We're grappling with racial and gender inequality. Affordable and renewable energy is just a dream for many people. And this is probably not the last pandemic that's caused in part by an encroachment of humans into endangered habitats. I'm thinking broadly about shaping the future because many of the challenges we're dealing with will only grow more complex if we don't take action today. For over 50 years, companies have operated using the first principle of maximizing shareholder value. With this mandate, the focus is on profits and share prices. But for many of these years, it was easy to see the connection between a company and its impact on local communities. CEOs would routinely meet with their workers, they lived in the same communities, A company's suppliers and customers were all part of a visible ecosystem. A company was naturally held accountable for its impact on a community because it was a part of that very community. But with economies of scale, globalization, digitization, the connections between stakeholders has grown more and more distant. And in turn, the accountability has become weaker and weaker, while the drive to serve that bottom line has become stronger. And for business leaders, there was no incentive or mandate to prioritize those consequences to other stakeholders. And economist Milton Friedman rallied the sentiment with his philosophy that the business of business is business. But some leaders have been pushing back. We're recognizing that in the relentless pursuit of the bottom line, we're actually hurting that very bottom line. Whether it was brand and reputational damage from consumers and employees who are concerned about those business practices, or dealing with the countervailing regulatory cost and efforts aimed at curbing or sometimes punishing that bottom line chasing behavior. Or it's even been the moral sentiments of leaders who want to practice business better and not be penalized for doing the right thing. And so 2 years ago, the Business Council Roundtable, the organization comprised of the CEOs of the world's largest companies, came together to reject shareholder capitalism and pledged instead to a broader, bolder mandate, a new statement on the purpose of a corporation. It declares that the purpose of a company should benefit all stakeholders, not just financial stakeholders. While the impact of that radical declaration may have been overshadowed by the pandemic that immediately followed it, now is the time for us to turn inspiration into perspiration. We've all agreed that these are the right things to do, but there's still so much to be done, not only in how we're going to measure progress, but the path we will take to achieve these goals. The answer lies in changes to business philosophy and methods, in innovative market solutions, as well as regulation in the law. But also, stakeholder capitalism will rely very heavily on behavioral change. And this is where behavioral economics comes in. While stakeholder capitalism can provide us with a North Star on what ought to be done, behavioral economics, with its insights on human nature, provides us with the strategies and the tools to drive behavior change. And many companies are doing it. We're working with Hellmann's to reduce food waste. We're working with Georgia Pacific on improving worker safety. We're working with the leaders at Canadian Tire Financial Services to improve the call center experience and help people manage their debt better. We're working with leaders at IBM to improve the happiness and the productivity and the collaboration amongst employees. We're working with TD Insurance to make buying insurance an easier and better experience for customers. We're working with innovators at Sidewalk Labs trying to pioneer and re-engineer the very cities we live in. And we're working with the city of Charlotte to transform recruiting of police forces to build better, more trusted leaders within the police community. And last but not least, we're working with governments like that in Myanmar to help protect democracy. When it comes to stakeholder capitalism, or more specifically sustainability, the biggest and most impactful moves may come from changing customer behavior. Unilever estimates that about 70% of the greenhouse gas footprint depends on which products customers choose and whether or not they dispose of them in a sustainable manner. So what are the barriers then that we face in driving behavioral change? Well, one is the say do gut. Let's think about our own behavior. We all say we want to be a part of change. But in a recent survey, 65% of us say that we want to buy purpose-driven brands that advocate sustainability. But the challenge is only about 26% of us do so. We all say we want to make sustainable choices. And yet Report after report concludes that plant-based diets are a major opportunity for mitigating and adapting to climate change. And yet, how many of us have made the shift to vegan diets, or at least routinely eating less meat? A second challenge is self-perception. It's not just the gap between what we say and what we do that we need to confront. It's our own self-perceptions. In our research on reducing food waste, over 80% of households say that they are above average when it comes to minimizing food waste. As consumers, we don't even see that we're part of the problem. And another barrier is we have a self-serving view of our own behavior. We all believe we're making good environmental choices. But in our research on food waste, consumers who put their food into the compost bin consider that a net positive environmental behavior. And while it is marginally better than discarding it into general land waste garbage, the manufacturing, the distribution, the storage of that food all still contributes greatly to greenhouse gas emissions. It's very human for us to justify our own behavior. So, how do we drive behavior change? It's not just as simple as labeling something green. For some businesses, the price of their products and services is going to have to increase, and we're going to have to get customer buy-in. How do we get people to pay more money for the same thing that they were getting before? How do we get people to change their preferences and their fundamental behaviors? We have challenges like customers not accepting the same volume of a product inside a box when companies are trying to decrease package waste. Companies are trying to reduce the overall weight of packages by using concentrated products and asking customers to merely add water. But then customers don't feel that the value is there. We have to overcome that misperception. There's slight inconvenience that might be introduced for things like introducing electric vehicles that require people to fundamentally change their behavior, and yet this is a way to radically reduce greenhouse gases. Or we have to confront our very identity. Something like vegan is seen as something soft and effeminate, and some people resist the idea of becoming vegan because of their own identity. So how do we drive behavior change? It's about understanding the foundations of behavior. It's the science of learning about the heuristics and biases that govern our choices. It's about leveraging choice architecture, the nudges and boosts and cascades of interventions that can come together to help shape behavior. What else do leaders need to do to unlock stakeholder value? They need to embrace scientific thinking. That means we can help leaders move beyond the vague domain of morality and doing the right thing, and instead ask questions like, how can we become a more purpose-driven organization? But instead of just getting stuck there, we can move beyond that to more concrete questions like, what specific behaviors do we need to change? How will we measure outcomes? What techniques of behavior change will be effective at turning intention into action? Leaders can stand on the shoulders of giants. You don't have to go it alone. There's a plethora of research on the psychology of decision-making and behavior that can help business leaders transform their products and services and lead to increases in stakeholder value. And last but not least, business leaders can embrace experimentation, a process of trial and error to discover what's working, what's effective at actually changing behavior. These are the nuts and bolts of making change happen. We need to take a close look at what choices we're making and what's keeping us from making those better choices, and how we can make decisions that improve the world. That means we need to go beyond thinking about using nudges for simple marketing challenges. Instead, we can think about the ways in which behavioral insights can help us achieve something bigger than that, to construct the world we want to live in. We live in a complex ecosystem where we all play the roles of consumers, producers, members of communities, and leaders. Success means empowering ourselves to be the best versions of humanity we can be for all stakeholders. Because there's never been a better time for us to rethink what it means to be a good leader, to create a thriving society by applying the science of behavior change. Thank you.
Welcome back. And I mentioned earlier that Kelly was kicking off the conference. And Kelly, is so kind of you to do that introduction. And I have spoken at conferences around the world. And I have to be honest in saying what you're bringing out today in terms of this intellectual firepower, it's not just because they have initials like PhD, but they're biased for action and doing things. You must be feeling pretty good right now that this is something that, you know, this woman that came from the startup world and the big banking world is now in a world where you can impact change. How's that feel?
I'm so proud. I'm so proud of the team that I get to work with, a team of scientists. It's amazing. The knowledge that they bring to every challenge is more about this mindset of science. And that is really the foundation of what BEworks is all about. But it's actually deeper than just the knowledge of science. Science is the stuff that's been written in books and it's published and there it is and we can review it and peer review it. But the fundamental part of what BEworks is all about is actually scientific thinking. And you don't have to wear a lab coat every day as a part of your job to be a scientific thinker. And that is where I think that there's so much potential and power in society, is for all of us to recognize some of those innate characteristics that we had when we were kids. You know, we were curious about things and we would try stuff and it would fall and it would break and you'd try again. You were naturally curious, you were naturally experimenting.
But, you know, a lot of that gets, I hate to use the word, but pounded out of us in school. You know, you're not the creative one. You're not the curious one. We go into an organization, we get into hierarchy and boxes, and we have a certain way of doing things. And you start coming along and saying, start thinking about science and the scientific process. Well, a lot of people, where they are, science might not have been their strong suit. It might not even be a subject they like. How do you get them to overcome their biases and open their minds that within that process is, in fact, some extraordinary, not just insights, but paths forward in terms of how to solve some of the problems you talked about. We're not just talking about growing market share. You're talking about the tension between food waste and hunger. I mean, so how do you get people to open their minds and say, this might be a better path forward?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. And I think that it actually starts with some questions, such as asking, how do you know? How do we know? How do I know when we're presented with information? Just that, you know, question around what's the certainty that we have on something is actually the potential to kind of opening up from just accepting assumptions or accepting traditions. And by doing that, you actually start to create a little window, a little ray of sunshine into allowing your imagination to think about the possibilities, to question why are things the way they are, and can we have a better world? And it matters, like, doesn't matter where you are, that you can actually start to challenge that. And we live so much in a world that has this kind of trust of authority, that it's kind of baked into an organization where you don't necessarily have that questioning, this role of ego and authority versus this democratized approach to questioning the knowledge that we have.
No, it's interesting as you listen to Kelly, and I want to encourage you at the entire 4-hour event. This is all recorded. It's all going to be made available to you. Put your pens down. Just not only listen generously, but what I'm doing is trying to say, how does it apply to my life? How does it apply to my livelihood? How does it apply to the planet? When you started off today, it was overpowering. I mean, some of the things that you talked about is the planet spinning out of control, humanity spinning out of control. And that you turned it around and you started talking about the hope. And it really came down to the sense of stakeholder capitalism. And I was fascinated by what you're talking about. What you're really saying now is that entities, organizations, even individuals, we got to look beyond our own gratification. Corporations would be profit and have a higher purpose. Do you think the world is ready to embrace that? Because as you said, it comes with a price. It might be the price you pay at the store. It might be coming, I can't drive my own car anymore. It might be, I've got to reuse the food in my fridge. Some of the case studies we'll talk about today, but are we ready for it, or is this just still an anomaly?
So at the risk of keeping our conversation deep, where we need to move past is looking at the world with these black and white ideological lenses that don't actually let us see the difference between truth and fiction or fact and myth. Scientific thinking is the method that will let us cut through that, to do these experiments, to generate the data, to see the things that will get us the results that we want in terms of what is real around climate change? What is real around income inequality and the impact that it has on society? What is real around the data that we have on healthy policing in our societies and healthy ways to manage our food ecosystem? Science is the thing that can bring us back together, where we can get unified around experiments and data and ultimately evidence. And that doesn't require us to be black and white and sit on one side of the fence or another, but to actually look at the evidence together, and then we can advance our cause to making the world a better place.
So let me play devil's advocate. So in this petri dish, this rigorous scientific process really comes up with some answers that we need. But then when you amplify to take it out, how do you overcome the biases, the confirmation biases? You're saying that's not possible, that's really not what I believe. How do you take this incredible study we're going to hear later on and next actually about Unilever and food waste and turn it into a movement around the world?
Yeah, so to take bias out of the process of the knowledge, creating knowledge, to take that bias out requires, again, some more fundamental scientific principles. First of all, it's humility and recognizing that when we're designing an experiment or when we're developing an opinion on something, first of all, have that humility to say, I might be wrong. A way to test your humility is to ask yourself the question regularly, what have you been wrong about? And if you can't answer that question and come up with a single thing that you've been wrong about, I mean something meaningful, don't joke around about something silly. You haven't found something in your life that you've been wrong about, you need to maybe dig a little bit deeper in your reflection, because humility is a fundamental attribute to making sure that we are updating our knowledge, taking in new information, and not being guilty of that confirmation bias that you described. Now let's scale that up. We've all been exposed to the various reports on COVID-19. Is it airborne? Is it, transmission through this thing, the effectiveness of the vaccines? Everybody is kind of a scientist right now. And one of the biggest challenges that we face is that science is this lurching forward, lurching back, lurching forward, big push back. What's right? What's wrong? But ultimately, science is this process of peer review where those biases basically get checked by others. And then there's a momentum, there's an expertise, there's a challenge, and that evidence must maintain that scrutiny, withstand that storm of questions. So that process of scientific thinking, when we bring that to individuals, when we bring that to our organizations, we realize that building knowledge is actually a team effort. And as we do that, we'll be able to continue to build better strategies and to launch these interventions that will lead to making the world a better place.
So Kelly, you've got people from BEworks all over the world listening in because now you've gone global, and I congratulate you on that because I love Canadian companies that have something and have this swagger and stature to do it. But you've also got over 1,000 people listening. What success means? My final question for you right now is, and I'll bring you back later on in the day for a wrap up, but what does success mean? What happens to the people that are listening when they finish with this 4-hour summit that you go, this was time well spent?
For me, one of the fundamental things for time well spent is for everyone to be curious about what does it mean to be a scientific thinker, to bring that question, to learn what those attributes are, and to use that set of attributes to realize that you have the ability to impact and influence, making the best of yourself, making the best of your family, making the best of your workplace, and making the best of the world.
So we're just been listening to Kelly Peters, and you can, I just get so energized when I'm in the room with her. And when she talked to me about, let's create a movement and let's do something that's bigger than a one-off or a campaign, I was so energized and excited. And I just want you to think about this. Imagine we're together 4 years from now, and let's pray it's all in a room. And we're in a room and we're talking about it. We can come back and say, on this day in 2021, that movement started. Kelly Peters, thank you so much for doing this entire event. I can't wait to share some of this intellectual firepower that you've brought and to bring it back later on.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Stick around, because right now we're going to talk to Dr. Angela Cooper on this whole idea of sustainability. We all say we want to do it, but what really impacts behavior? And Dr. Sarah Carpenter, sorry, I always think of the French because I'm French Canadian. She's going to talk about big data. We think it's I've heard it's the new oil. Well, she's going to surprise you, because she's going to talk to you about how behavioral economics combined with your big data is the secret sauce.
Our next speaker is Dr. Angela Cooper, and she answers this question: how can we launch sustainability initiatives that actually make a difference? In her lightning talk, Dr. Angela Cooper, associate at BEworks, will walk you through a powerful case study demonstrating how understanding the psychological barriers to sustainability enables us to launch and test new solutions. We all know that companies are being judged for their CSR initiatives more than ever. That makes choosing the right sustainability initiatives and delivering impactful solutions that actually change behavior as being critical. Angela's expertise brings the behavioral science insights and rigorous empirical testing needed to ensure that the importance of these initiatives is matched by their effectiveness. Angela holds a PhD in linguistics at Northwestern University. She completed a research fellowship at the University of Toronto. Her work studying the psychology of human language development and how people adapt to change in their environments has been featured by CBC and CTV News. At BEworks, Angela uses her expertise in behavior change to solve sustainability challenges such as food waste reduction. Dr. Cooper, over to you.
My mother is someone who doesn't believe in waste. She's the kind of person who washes out and reuses empty margarine tubs or even Ziploc sandwich bags. She finds ways to use up every scrap of food. Leftovers are reimagined into different meals. Meatloaf for dinner one night becomes sandwiches for lunch the next. I've got memories of being scolded for not turning out the lights when I left the room because it was a waste of energy. I'm sure most of us have family members who are like this. And we attribute it to a kind of bygone age where they weren't necessarily concerned with abstract environmental ideals, but very pragmatic considerations, the need to save money and conserve their resources in a time when such things were scarce. But over the last several decades, waste has become a sign of prosperity. The ability to continually purchase new clothing or new products, to have multiple cars to service a family's transportation needs, to lay out tables groaning with food. All of this has become markers of our success. But this kind of indulgence has not been without consequence. For instance, we produce over 300 million tons of plastic waste each year. And if trends continue, our oceans could contain more plastic than fish by 2050. 1/3 of all food produced in the world, over 1 billion tons, goes to waste. Deforestation, the burning of fossil fuels for electricity, heat, and transportation, all of this has contributed to our current climate crisis. The concentration of CO2 in our atmosphere as of summer 2021 is the highest it's been in human history. Take food waste, for instance. If food wastage were a country, it would be the 3rd largest CO2 emitting nation in the world. Unchecked, all of this will have severe consequences. Climate change could result in more than 100 million people returning to extreme poverty by as soon as 2030. So we've come to realize that many of the kinds of behaviors that my mother engaged in can't just be quaint memories of how our parents or our grandparents used to act, but are in fact critical and necessary behaviors for ensuring our planet's future. Thankfully, an increasing number of people recognize that they want to do something, that they want to start engaging in sustainable behaviors. And this is increasingly reflected at the corporate level, in a recent shift by many global corporations from shareholder capitalism, that is, serving their own corporate purpose and shareholders, towards stakeholder capitalism, committing to an investment in their employees, their suppliers, and the environment. And indeed, many major corporations have taken up the climate challenge by introducing their own sustainability initiatives, aligning themselves, for instance, with the UN Sustainability Development Goals. But while the motivation to act may be on the rise, how to best to meet this challenge and actually change our behavior is still a difficult question. The urgency of this climate challenge needs to be matched with rigor and the scientific method. The fact is, we don't have the time to be investing resources into sustainability initiatives that simply don't yield the necessary impact with consumers. Many of the requisite steps to mitigating this climate crisis involve changing people's behavior. And as such, leveraging insights from behavioral science research will be key, as it will enable the more efficient development of sustainability strategies that can effectively target and overcome barriers to the desired behaviors, maximizing the potential impact of such strategies. It will also be critical to use rigorous testing to validate that impact and determine the efficacy of such interventions. Taking this kind of evidence-based approach involving research, strategy, and impact will ensure that resources can be invested in the right places. Now, what could this actually look like in practice? Let me provide you a case study to illustrate. So Unilever is one such company who recognizes the value of taking this approach. And in partnership with Hellmann's, BEworks tackled the challenge of reducing household food waste with a multi-phase, iterative testing approach involving research, strategy development, and impact measurement. So we gathered primary data and drew upon scientific research to help inform our understanding of what factors influence the magnitude of a household's food waste output, to help us determine where and how to intervene. And from this research phase, we learned that rather than focusing on helping people plan or shop better to prevent a surplus of food entering the home, that a fruitful starting place for interventions would be to help people recover the food they already have and save it from being thrown out. Because no matter how well we plan, life gets in the way, and we need a strategy for what to do when it does. So to help shape that strategy, we first needed to understand the psychological journey of food recovery so that we could design interventions accordingly. So recovering food in one's home involves first rediscovering what food you actually have. That is, seeing that piece of carrot or celery stalk that's buried in the back of the fridge. Next, it's about reevaluating that food, so determining whether or not you think it's actually fit to be eaten. And finally, repurposing that food into new meals. And so based on this strategic framework, we designed interventions to help support these stages of food recovery. Specifically, we developed interventions to help people better see the food they have by increasing its salience in the fridge, and an intervention to help people figure out how to use up their food. So here, we provided an easy rule of thumb to use during meal preparation to encourage flexibility and creativity. And to make things even easier, we simply asked people to choose one day per week to use that rule of thumb to help make a meal using the food they already have. Now, it wasn't enough to just develop these interventions. It was also critical to determine what kind of impact they actually have on food waste. And so we conducted a randomized control trial over 5 weeks, one of the largest field studies of its kind, testing over 900 families in Canada. One group received just our Use Up intervention. Other groups received both the Use Up intervention plus a tool to help increase that food salience. And so we tracked their self-reported food waste over 5 time points. And while all groups started with roughly the same amount of food waste at the beginning of the study, we saw that those who received our interventions significantly reduced their food waste over time relative to control participants received no interventions. And in fact, households who received our interventions saw a 33% reduction from their baseline in self-reported food waste in just 1 month. And you can see that all our intervention groups were equally effective. And this means that certain interventions, specifically our salience tools to help people see what they have, didn't help people reduce their food waste above and beyond the Use Up intervention alone. And so this highlights the critical need to test for impact. By conducting this field study, we now know that developing and distributing tools to increase food salience would not be a good use of time or resources when this initiative is scaled up globally, saving Hellmann's thousands of dollars and man-hours that could be put to better use. So this case study demonstrates that having an empirical framework helped us to determine not just the how, but the how much. That is, how to develop sustainability strategies, but also how much real-world impact they can have. So the future depends on companies and their consumers taking decisive action, making changes to their behavior that actually have an impact. And for companies engaged in sustainability initiatives, behavioral science, its methods and its insights, provides that way forward to have the kind of impact with consumers and our environment that's so sorely needed.
Our next speaker is Dr. Sarah Carpentier, and she answers this question: how do behavioral science and data science intersect to create more impactful solutions for organizations and people alike? In her talk, Big Data and BEE, Creating Bigger Impact Without the Risk, Dr. Carpentier will provide an overview on how data science and behavioral science complement one another and how they can come together for a more powerful organizational toolset. Today, data points are easier to capture than ever before. The challenge is going beyond measurement to change the patterns in the data and grounding the insights gleaned in scientific theories of human behavior. Behavioral science can help organizations ask the right questions and move the needle in a way that data science can't. Sarah has a PhD in cognitive neuroscience from the University of Toronto, the science of how the mind arises from the brain. Sarah's background in neuroscience and music preferences generated insight in how the complex interplay of the brain activity and environmental context influence her choices and behavior. Her thesis was selected by the Department of Psychology as one of the top dissertations in the country. She also spent years as a frontline distress and crisis line responder for both the Distress Centre of Toronto and the Canadian Suicide Prevention Services. She provided support to people who felt vulnerable and alone. Sarah's passionate about transforming society by applying relevant, data-driven insights and has worked on such BEworks projects as large-scale field experiments, AI, and the co-designer of the BEworks Empathetic Communications Training Program for improving the effectiveness of interpersonal communication that is currently deployed within some of the largest organizations and call centers in Canada. Dr. Sarah Carpentier, it's over to you.
In Douglas Adams's novel, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and bear with me, this is relevant, a highly intelligent alien species tasks a supercomputer named Deep Thought to calculate the answer to life, the universe, and everything. The computer spends 7.5 million years feeding all possible information into its computations and produces an answer: 42. Everyone is understandably disappointed and doesn't know what to do with that result. And Deep Thought responds, "Only when you know the question will you know what the answer means." Data scientists can be amazing supercomputers, but any pattern recognition without the proper understanding of why that pattern exists, what it means, what the question is really answering, and what to do about it is just as useful as finding the answer 42. We need to make sure we have the science part of data science. Thank you for joining me to talk about how we can shape a future with data science and behavioral science collaborating to efficiently and successfully uncover key insights and know what to do with those insights. In 2012, the Harvard Business Review published an article calling data science the sexiest job of the 21st century. And I will say I want the branding and PR team for data science to work for me, because no one ever said when I said I taught statistics, wow, she must be really cool. So We've all heard stories of great successes that applied statistics has had to solve business challenges and the very real ways that people are missing out by making decisions using intuition rather than evidence. And there's been a big increase in the willingness and the desire of organizations to capitalize on analytical tools that have become increasingly available, right? The demand for data science was up 50% in 2020. But with all this excitement and interest, we need to make sure that we're applying it right to get the return we actually need. Because over the past 10 years, there have also been enough people who took up that message of, great, I will use numbers and analytics to guide business strategy. And then after a few years, feel like maybe their big data strategy, the one they've implemented, is just really not living up to their expectations. They're not getting the impact that they're looking for from their approach. Some estimates suggest that around 80% of data science projects fail to achieve significant impact. So why is that? Most often, it's not a technical problem. It's not because these companies are not investing in fancy enough algorithms. Trust me, sometimes the problem is the opposite. It's because their analytics-oriented strategy pays a lot of attention to the data side and the math side, and not enough to the science side of data science. Right? All of the onus for a fully formed, ready-to-go solution is being put on bare numbers, usually ones that can be pulled from existing data the company already has. But human behavior is complicated. Understanding it, predicting it, and changing it is complicated. And organizations are clearly not getting enough of what they need to make a decision with a couple of data points. Right? In order for an isolated insight that a company uncovers about its customer behavior to be successfully put to use, it needs to be understood through the lens and the context of all that we already know about human behavior, right? A lot of strategies focus on building complex pattern recognition systems, but finding any pattern is not the same thing as properly understanding it and how it should fit into decision-making for the organization. We don't just want 42. We want to know what that means and what to do with it. To give a quick example of how behavioral science can fill in the gaps that are existing in a lot of data science strategies, we were involved with one company who was interested in having their salespeople function more efficiently and effectively. And as a part of their plan to find a solution and figure out how to better hone their team, they got their data team to build a predictive model of sales success, looking at which factors in their salespeople are correlated with successful sales. Their model was actually pretty good at predicting past sales. However, for all that investment, they actually didn't make something that was particularly useful for the overall business goal. That was because nothing in their model made good sense for an intervention point. Nothing that they said predicted sales was easily changeable. Things like tenure, geographic location, and a big one was sales the previous month. So these are not things that we actually have the power to change to help people do better. So we didn't actually learn very much that would help us build a strategy. A large reason for why their model was built this way is what's called the reactive analytics approach. An organization has a challenge, and they expect that the insights, the answer they need exists in the current data they already have on file, and they ask for very quick turnaround time on those insights. So the team put into the model what was the most accessible, but not really the most useful. With the data they had, they could get an answer, but this was not the one they really needed. So we pulled from what science already knows about human behavior relating to sales and used that to inform what should go into a new, more strategic model, right? Both from existing data they had and from new data to be collected, in order to have a model that can actually be actionable for behavior change. The output of that new model now clearly indicated behaviors that could be targeted for improvement. And then BEworks worked to develop strategies for behavior change to nudge people towards those behaviors. And then we designed experiments to test which of those behavior change strategies would be the most effective and should be scaled to field. This is one of the ways behavioral science and data science collaborate to move the needle. There's a saying, garbage in, garbage out. It doesn't matter how fancy your machine learning tools are. If what you're putting into them isn't right in the first place, then what you're going to get out of them won't be right. Data teams know this. This is why they are frequently the ones who point to us to point them in the right direction for what should be the right data to put in, so that it doesn't take them 7.5 million years, and to help them understand how to interpret what comes out. Because when a pattern is found, right, you need to know what it means and what to do with it. When behavioral scientists are faced with a question, we start by reaching into the past century of human behavior research, right? Let's leverage what knowledge already exists rather than wasting resources trying to relearn something. Then we design creative, targeted strategies and experiments to get the specific new data we need for what still needs to be uncovered. By following this theory and hypothesis-driven approach, when we get the output from the analytics, now the project is best positioned to interpret those results properly to influence the best course of action, right? This is how to elevate impact from data science alone. When we get 42, now we know what it means and we know what we should do about it. So to recap a little bit, right? Behavioral scientists guide the team, the data teams of analysts, experts in AI and machine learning on what data should be considered valid input for their models and including how to get that data when we don't have it already. We understand the real-world full context implications of those data patterns. We create behavior change interventions, and we learn cause and effect through experimentation. In the last minute I have, what do I mean by cause and effect? Well, let's examine that through a quick example. Say your company offers 4 different products, and your data team tells you that when faced with choice between these 4 products, consumers by far and away choose one over the other 3. What decision should you make? Should you eliminate the other 3 options? The science of human behavior will tell you that making that assumption is a very large risk, and you don't have the data to support it, right? Experiments have already repeatedly shown that human preferences are influenced by the other choices that were available at the time. Behavioral scientists develop informed hypotheses, design data strategies, and creative experiments to learn about cause and effect. So now we can answer the question, what will happen if I remove the other 3 choices? Or the question, how should I most effectively encourage customers to choose one of the other options instead? These questions call for small, lower risk experiments, sometimes ones we call randomized control trials, that determine cause and effect before taking an idea full scale to field. So we don't have a lot of time today. We could enjoy talking more about experiments and randomized control trials on a different day. So as we're getting to the end here, what I've been thinking about is not leveraging the robust theories and insights about human behavior that have been developed over decades and how to conduct human research, and not conducting proper testing of strategies in low-risk environments is, at best, preventing organizations from propelling forward. And even worse, it's sometimes causing very real and very high-profile problems. An approach of the numbers are all we need is how we get sales models that aren't actionable, biased hiring algorithms, biased credit card limits, and music recommendations that suggest Coldplay to everyone. We don't need to be making these mistakes. We don't need to be trying to relearn insights that behavioral science already knows, right? So data science on the one hand has a mastery in pattern recognition, statistics, and computer science. And then we have behavioral science on the other hand with the deep expertise of human behavior and social interactions and the creative experimentation techniques for finding targeted answers and uncovering cause and effect. By partnering data with behavioral science, we can be more targeted and accurate about guiding our analytics experts to know where to look and what the right answer is when they find it. We can understand the meanings of patterns when we find them. We can work simultaneously to develop behavior change strategies, and we can learn about cause and effect of intervening for change in a low-risk environment. Otherwise, all you've got is 42. Thank you for your time.
Well, earlier on, I talked about just put your note paper down. We're going to have everything recorded and just start thinking about how it applies to your life. And the two things I took away from this talk, I love the whole Unilever. I mean, it was such a remarkable breakthrough to use scientific thinking, behavioral economics, to realize that what's in your fridge can be there to improvise, to create, to curate, to put it together. And just that simple act changed the way people viewed something that should be thrown out to something that should be thrown together and to create something that's just that everybody enjoys. Data was an interesting one for me too, because I've been hearing so often how data is the new oil. But when you use the metaphor, and what I really took away is data doesn't have a heartbeat. You need human interaction. You need to understand how we think, feel, and behave. So when you combine that big data with behavioral economics, that's 1 + 1 = 11. So it's some great talks. We're gonna take a 5-minute break, stretch, get some water, because we're going right now into the future of a whole employee behavior. This thing I'm fascinated about, Dr. Nate Barr is gonna be joining. He's gonna do a keynote, and I'm gonna chat with him. I wanna talk about this concept of this great resignation. And what does it mean to try to retain the people that matter to you, but at the same time also have to onboard a whole new group of people? What's going to go on with that? We're going to look at diversity and inclusion, one of the biggest topics in terms of not something we need to do or should do, but the importance of doing it. And in terms of everything that Kelly talked over, stakeholder capitalism, in terms of being a better culture, more diverse thinking, it's going to go on to it. And lots coming up. 5 minutes. We'll see you back then. Welcome back to BEworks Shaping the Future Summit. If you're just joining us, we had an incredible start, really started focusing on some of the big bets in society, some of the problems that we're facing, and how scientific process and behavioral economics can play an instrumental role in not just solving a little problem, but solving some of the biggest problems. We're now moving on to this employee behavior, shaping the future of employee behavior. My podcast and radio show, Chatter That Matters, I get to talk to a lot of people, not-for-profit, for-profit, and without exception, people talk about the importance of talent. Talent will be our tiebreaker going forward. So we wanted to lead off with one of the most extraordinary thinkers on employee behavior, Dr. Nate Bard. And Nate teaches creativity. Nate is renowned around the world in terms of his thinking of applying creativity to the workforce. How are humans going to exist with machine learning, artificial intelligence? And we're going to start with Nate. We're going to move into an entire section on it. So if talent matters to you, attracting, retaining, onboarding, finding your point of difference with it, the next hour is going to be magical. Let's introduce Nate.
Dr. Nathaniel Barr answers this question. How can we build the workplace of the future in a way that brings out the best in all of us and brings the most value to the world? Amidst the disruption of COVID-19, organizations have been faced with countless challenges, including how to foster an innovative and creative workplace. Dr. Nathaniel Barr's talk, The Essential Elements of the Workplace of the Future, he will share how organizations can turn what seems like a challenge into a prime opportunity to foster ingenuity and productivity in the workplace. Dr. Barr is a scientific advisor at BEworks, where he helps bring behavioral science to bear on the most pressing organizational and societal challenges of this era. He holds a PhD from the University of Waterloo, professor of creativity and creative thinking at Sheridan College. He teaches courses aimed at enhancing creative and innovative potential and holds several federal research grants which leverage behavioral science to solve practical challenges. He is published widely in both academic journals and popular outlets on an array of topics, including creativity, innovation, and the intersection of thinking and technology. And Nathaniel Barr's work has been covered in media around the world. And after his keynote, stay tuned for my fireside chat with Dr. Nathaniel Barr.
Thanks for joining us today. Excited to talk to you about the essential elements of the workplace of the future. And of course, when we think about the workplace today and probably going forward, the most immediate thing that we see in the landscape is COVID-19. The image before you now is COVID-19 virus under an electron microscope. And it's clear that this tiny little thing, this minuscule virus, has brought about disproportionately massive changes to our world. To date, the cases number in the hundreds of millions. We've lost millions of people to the virus. And for the purposes of today's talk, it's worth considering the way that COVID-19 has upended the economy and more broadly, how we connect with each other, both interpersonally and within the workplace. It's clear that these sweeping changes are taking place, and I think it's also clear that quite a few of them are likely to be permanent. Work is probably one of the areas of our lives that has been most disrupted. If you look to some of the data, for example, from Stats Canada, we see a massive increase in the number of workers performing their duties from home. Whereas only 4% were working from home in 2016, from April 2020 to June 2021, almost 1/3 of workers were working mostly from home. Of course, this differs across sectors. We see majority, somewhere around 7 in 10 of people in finance, insurance, professional services, whereas only about 5% of people in things like food services. And of course, we can't forget our friends and colleagues in the healthcare system who have been out on the front lines, helping us overcome the challenges before us. Not only has this pandemic disrupted what exactly we're doing each day and where we're doing it, it's led to some questioning of the fundamental assumptions around what work should be like. For example, there was a recent article in The Atlantic penned by Ed Zitron that told us to say goodbye to our manager, identifying perhaps the shortcomings in our organizational structuring such that we have a bit too much administrative bloat and not enough people working directly. Whether that comes to be, we shall see. And not only is it changing perhaps where we are, what we're doing, and maybe who is overseeing us, it's also dynamically altered the way that people feel about their work. For example, one of the really influential pieces coming out of the pandemic discourse was one by a fellow psychologist, Adam Grant, wherein he identified languishing as the dominant emotion of the pandemic, this sense of stagnation and emptiness. And this is translated into people making interesting career choices. Another New York Times piece written by Kevin Roos called "Welcome to the YOLO Economy" describes this rising trend, particularly amongst relatively well-off corporate workers, where they're just giving up the gig and going off to start their own thing, desiring some influx of flexibility and making them question, what is it I'm doing in an office for my whole life? Maybe there's something more out there. To sum some of this up, there seems to be disruption both to traditional operations, boiling down to even office real estate and how many desks we need. But there's also a sense that there's some influence on aspects of recruitment and retention and other HR-related issues. So, for example, Deloitte relatively recently came out saying that all their staff could work from home forever. Other giants in the industrial landscape like Google, Microsoft, Twitter, and a whole host of others have also suggested to their employees that things will not be the same. You might have seen there's open discourse today around whether relocating to a less centralized location for work demands the same high salaries that you might get in a major hub. So when we look to what people are thinking about this, we can see outsized opinions in what they think they should be doing on the daily basis. So, for example, the World Economic Forum conducted a survey, and most people indicated they did want flexibility in where and when and how they work. And almost a third of the people surveyed said they would quit their job if they were forced to return to the office full time. So, to think this through, it's obvious that things have changed. What remains unclear, though, is what the essential elements of the workplace of the future will be, beyond a few obvious tasks. So the other thing worth considering, though, is that while COVID-19 has served as a catalytic agent and propelled the rate of change to become faster, it's also worth remembering that these winds of change were blowing strong long before the virus came along. In particular, we see this through the technological revolutions that are underway across all aspects of society. To characterize these changes and what has been called the Fourth Industrial Revolution, Klaus Schwab, founder and executive chairman of the World Economic Forum, states that we stand on the brink of a technological revolution that will fundamentally alter the way we live, work, and relate to one another. This obviously isn't the first, given I've said it's the fourth industrial revolution, but just think back. In the late 1700s, we saw steam and water technology change the way that manufacturing and transportation occurred, fundamentally altering the lives of millions of people. Late 1800s, we saw the onset of electricity and another rise in rapid industrialization, transforming the economy and the way that people lived. The third industrial revolution in the late 60s came about mostly due to the ability to effectively manufacture things like semiconductors, mainframe computers, and we saw information technology rise to be an absolutely integral part of nearly every industry. Today, as we enter the fourth industrial revolution, we're seeing this unique fusion of new technologies and their interaction across the physical, digital, and biological domains. We've been here before, but in some ways, it seems that this is an unprecedented revolution. The velocity at which change is happening seems faster than ever. The breadth and depth, the way that we're seeing fundamental, deep changes, as well as very wide-ranging changes, seems unparalleled according to many experts. And we're seeing perhaps unparalleled systems impact in which nearly every aspect of society and the economy is seeing disruption as a consequence of these technologies. So what are we looking at? Been a bit vague on that so far. When we think about the fourth industrial revolution, we're seeing things like AI, most central, advanced robotics, autonomous vehicles, the Internet of Things, blockchain, 3D printing. How about a shout out to mRNA vaccines? We're seeing synthetic biological advances, things like gene editing that were once the stuff of science fiction. If you want to wrap your head around perhaps my favorite bizarre technological progression, I implore you to Google xenobots, which variably might be called synthetic life forms or biological robots. So in thinking about the impacts of this, I think it's worth noting that Schwab, despite these movements being predicated upon technology, really focuses in on the human element in describing what's happening, the way we live, work, and relate to one another. I think there's a commonality with COVID-19 in that though the pandemic is operating at the microscopic level, its true impacts are at the level of behavior. And we can see that both due to this pandemic and the technological shifts underway, that connecting, communicating, collaborating, creating, working together will not be staying the same. In thinking through what the implications are in the years to come, I point you to some fantastic work out of RBC Thought Leadership describing the coming creativity boom, how human ingenuity will power the 2020s. So on one hand, while these challenges that we face within industry and society are clear, and it's obvious that we need to derive solutions so as not to fall behind, this piece argues that we should also be open to imagining the vast opportunities for improvement that have presented themselves. In this piece, they describe a vision for the soaring 20s, an era punctuated by novel and adaptive thinking, and an opportunity to reimagine the future of behavior, including how we work. For example, they cite LinkedIn data that creativity is the top skill of this era. We need this novel and useful solution generation that will help economic recovery and an adjustment to the new realities of the working world. They suggest towards the conclusion of this report that we're ready to enter an exciting age of ideas. So how do I feel about this argument? I think they're spot on. However, I do think we need to go further. In articulating why I think we need to go further, I'll point you to a now classic HBR article by Theodore Levitt, longtime Harvard Business School professor. He penned an essay entitled "Creativity is Not Enough." And this was around the time that there was a bit of a boom in the industrial adoption of creative problem-solving techniques, similar to what we're seeing called for today. But Levitt differed a bit in that he thought maybe it's the idea generation that's the easy part. So to quote Levitt, "Ideation is relatively abundant. Implementation is more scarce." And he argued that many advocates for creativity have failed to distinguish between the relatively easy process of being creative in the abstract and the infinitely more difficult process of being innovationist in the concrete. So to go beyond this age of ideas, we need an age of creative implementation, and that necessitates a framework for innovation. Now, various scholars and management thinkers have advocated for a whole litany of approaches to driving innovation, but I'll point you now to BEworks co-founder and CEO Kelly Peters. In spring 2020, the Rotman Management magazine put forth a special issue on behavioral insights, and therein, Kelly articulated a vision wherein behavioral science can provide that framework for innovation that we discussed, critically offering a means of propelling creative ideas into action that is measurable, observable, and testable. This requires a vantage that prizes scientific rigor over opinion or intuition. So in order for you to more completely apprehend what it means for behavioral science to be a framework for innovation, we can look to the BEworks method. The BEworks method is a three-phased approach, and this has been developed by Kelly and her colleagues over many years of solving practical challenges in field. So what does it look like? It looks like a successive turn through research phases, which then inform new strategy and solutions, and those new strategies and solutions are rolled out and subjected to impact evaluation through the rigorous methods of science. So let me walk you through this a little bit. The research phase first begins with really getting the story straight between organizational leaders about which measurable, observable behaviors are trying to be changed and how you might measure them. We find in our experience that there's often a gulf between the rhetorical, high-level discussions around, yeah, we should increase trust, for instance, and the actual agreement within a room about what we're even talking about when we use the word trust. So the first thing you need to do is get these definitions straight and how you might measure it. Once this is established, we can move into diagnosing the behavior that is influencing decisions in the workplace. And this is where you need experts on research and decision-making and behavior, because oftentimes these take the form of biases, beliefs, attitudes, and experiences. So the more we can map out current state behavior, understand the cognitive or emotional biases happening within our workforce, then we can derive effective solutions that overcome these barriers. Once we have an understanding of these barriers, next we can generate hypotheses about how we might overcome these barriers to the desired behaviors we wish to see. So this is the phase where the famous idea of nudge comes into play, as does our creativity. We're able to draw insights from the scientific literature on previously successful behavioral interventions, plus use our intuition, experience, and creativity to come up with solutions that have not been tried. Once we've prioritized the ideas that we think warrant a foray into the field, we can put them to the test in this third phase of impact evaluation. Randomized controlled trials are probably the best option, in which you randomly assign people to control or experimental groups where they either get this, that, or the other thing. But there's many ways that we could discuss that we can empirically, rigorously detect whether strategies and solutions we're trying have positive impact. From there, once you're armed with this understanding of what worked, what didn't, and perhaps why, then we can try and scale these things across an organization. And this process really drives innovation quite directly through the amount of risk-taking we're able to take. If we're trying several strategies concurrently and seeing which one works best, oftentimes we can push the limits and do something that's perhaps a bit more out there. So to contextualize a bit more what it means to take a behavioral lens, let's quickly look at a few of the dominant questions that are dominating discourse amongst today's organizational leaders. In 2018, Kelly and I wrote a piece for behavioral scientists looking at the rise of the augmented worker. And the big question at hand is, how can firms get the benefits of AI without erasing uniquely human strengths? What we mean by augmented workers is human intelligence supported by artificial intelligence. Of course, to do this through the BEworks method, we need to break this down, but you can see, just as an example, imagine the decision aids that we see taking hold in areas like medical diagnostics and financial trading, where augmenting human decision-making with artificial intelligence aids can improve our performance. So here, the key measurable observable behavior is our willingness to take into account AI suggestions in our decision-making. We must overcome things like overconfidence and general resistance to technology. And so if it is the case these aids are better than us alone, we need to build and test creative interventions that overcome these barriers to getting us to adopt these algorithmic aids into our decision-making. And in concluding, it's worth pointing out that the critical thing here is that we may have ideas for how to do this, but this isn't a race to the finish. The pace of technological change today is suggestive that we're going to continually have to experiment and innovate. And this is a battle for the optimization of extended human ability. And in our view, to win that battle, we must use behavioral science. How about something more related to COVID-19? Early in the pandemic in 2020, a number of us got our heads together and thought about what it means for work from home in the behavioral sense. So we articulated a vision that if we could account for these behavioral concerns, we might usher in a new era of prosperity and well-being in the workforce. We rattled off a few ideas. Of course, there's many more. Things like trust, creativity, connection, collaboration, and psychological safety seem paramount. And of course, the literature does have insights for us on how to help this situation. So, as an example, if employers think leaders don't trust them, they're less productive and engaged. But we also know that transparency and openness of information can help foster a sense of trust, perhaps a direct solution. How about collaboration? We've lost that constant communication that is possible in person when we can point across and wave someone over across the office. However, research from the Academy of Management Journal shows that bursty communication might be best. By that we mean, rather than constantly communicate, you have flurries of activity when needed and then periods of silence. So maybe we just need to calibrate our expectations. One that is particularly relevant to me is creativity. A lot of people feared that we lose some of these original ideas that we see due to a lack of collaborative collisions. You know, there's not that spontaneous ideation that occurs collaboratively. But research actually shows that brainstorming alone and then coming together in a group to discuss might produce better ideas. Likewise, there's evidence to suggest that electronic brainstorming done through various apps can get around some of the social dynamic impediments to the best ideas. For example, the loudest person in the room, which is never me, taking over the discourse within a brainstorming session. So this provides some useful starting points, but it's wise to remember that contexts and companies are unique and times change. So as much as I can point you to some of the relevant research, these should be conceived as ideational starting points that can then become hypotheses, which then can be prototyped and developed into solutions, and then we subject to the rigor of science. To give you a real example of something we're doing today at BEworks, consider our office. As the restrictions have abated and the risk seems to be reducing, it's possible for people to return to the office. In the true spirit of science, however, rather than just go with what seems to be the most optimal arrangement based on our intuition, we're rolling out the BEworks Open House Plan. People are free to come and go, use the office as they wish, and we'll be collecting data on how many people come in, how they choose to use that time, and as well, we'll launch surveys looking at whether people are meeting their needs psychologically, as well as whether this is conducive to meeting our organizational goals. So rather than going in with a specific idea based on what we think, we're going to collect data in a rigorous way and try and make an informed evidence-based choice and allow us to learn what model works best under what circumstances. So we've covered a lot of ground here thinking about the essential elements of the workplace of the future. And as we collectively prognosticate, I think we can all agree that it's evident that things will be changing. What is driving this is clearly the COVID-19 pandemic today, and in the slightly longer history of our species, the fourth industrial revolution rising to the fore. And this has changed not just how we work, it changed how we feel about work, and those technological advances have also provided new potential for imagining completely different models of work and workplaces. So in thinking through that big question of what are the essential elements of the workplace, I think it's clear that it will be technologically advanced, it should be flexible, it should be adaptive, it should be creative, and I think that the best workplaces of the future will be informed and grounded by the science of behavior. Thank you.
You can certainly understand why Nate is one of the most popular professors, and you covered so much ground in 20 minutes. I guess I want to wear the hat of a lot of people that are going, this is all uncharted ground. I mean, you're working remote, COVID mentality, this great resignation, trying to keep the talent that matters, onboard new talent. All of this is new. So tell me a little bit more about, if I was to bring you into my organization and really with the word help me figure this out, how would you approach that problem? Because I'm not sure what to do.
Right, it's a good question. I think that some of what we've talked about today in terms of the BEworks method holds special promise in navigating some of this uncertainty. In particular, I think that we really need to start researching each organization internally and get a lay of the land on what exactly is happening. Depending on the sector, depending on the particular company, we might be seeing different forces at work. For example, depending on the degree of technological change they might be experiencing. So as always, we would suggest starting with a mindset of curiosity and scientific thinking and start to pursue first, what are the questions that matter most for our organization?
When you start asking questions like that to employees, is that a bit of a ray of hope that says, I'm interested in working with you to find the right path, as opposed to just dictating from above that this is the path we're going to travel?
I think so. I think in particular, given what you said about the times of uncertainty that we're experiencing, it's important for employees to recognize that their leaders and their organizations are interested in adapting and flexibly reimagining what work might look like in a way that's both responsive to human needs, but also the broader trends that we see in the world.
I love what you said, that COVID is an anomaly, but but pre-COVID, a lot of this stuff was happening. So COVID just accelerated it. There's going to be a day when some people are going to have to go home and say, I lost my job to AI or a machine, where other people are going to skip because their lives are completely changed because, as you said, that they can work in step with it. What's your advice to organizations in terms of how they come to terms with, as they bring in this new technology, knowing that people remain the tiebreaker, that it's in step together.
Right. I think one of the most important things to recognize as we see these technological changes make their way into the workforce is that no matter what type of business we're in the business of behavior, and employees are going to play an important role, whether it be navigating the technological challenges that come with the onboarding and implementation of new technology, or quite simply managing algorithmic decision-making systems rather than managing humans. So I think that an important thing to consider is not an outright displacement, but rather a shift in the types of things that humans are doing versus what the machines are capable of doing.
So I love, the BEworks and behavior and the word be, and I've always believed that humans want to be curious, they want to be alive, they want to be together, be connected, be adventurous. What you did with Unilever earlier, just the sense of be an impresario in my kitchen, taking things I used to throw away and make a meal. What can we do with your world of creativity to let our employees know that to be and to be part of something, to have that higher purpose is what we're all about? Like what role does behavioral economics play within a culture to really elevate that sense of creativity, the thing that you're a world leader on?
I think probably the first thing to start with when we start thinking about the intersection of behavioral economics and creativity is to dispel any myth that science and creativity are the antithesis of one another. Rather, scientific thinking is punctuated by creative thinking. And in particular, the role of experimentation within organizations allows us to test drive and see which of our particular new strategies or new interventions are most effective. So rather than just pick one road and decide to drive it, rather we can experiment and try new things and drive innovation through that. And the other piece of this, beyond the recognition that the scientific process is highly creative, is this lesson that we can actually measure and understand things that seem ephemeral or fleeting or difficult to understand through the rigor of the scientific method. Creativity wasn't really subjected to the scrutiny of the scientific method till the 1950s. And since then, we've made leaps and bounds. And the more we can scientifically understand something, the better able we are to manipulate that ability within people for the better.
When I look at great organizations and you see this swell of that hierarchy's disappearing, it's much more collaborative, it's much more of a flattened organization. That requires a whole new type of leadership. Is one of the things that you're involved with is helping leaders come to terms with what might have worked in the past isn't going to work in the future, and we have to have a whole different mindset to make sure we retain the talent that matters?
I think so. I think that one of the most important steps toward adapting to the current climate is a simple recognition that what has gone before may not be the most adaptive path now. And of course, behavioral economics literature has all sorts of findings and research that allows us better insight into why it is the case that some of us are more resistant to change and changing the way that we think about leadership, organizational design, and employee behavior. So certainly an important part of our quest is to get people to open up their mind to new possibilities and quite frankly, start to experiment with new ways of thinking about employee behavior.
There seems to be incredible pent-up demand. As soon as the stores opened up, people rushed back to Main Street. How do you view what's going to happen in terms of the work environment? Because this hybrid culture, again, is untested territory. What are the things we should be excited about as leaders, and what are the things that we should be watching out for? And again, how does the scientific process help us understand and remove biases?
I think one of the most exciting things about this era, when you think about the positives, is that these are empirical questions. We can forecast and we can make predictions based on what we already know about human behavior. We can look to past trends, things like that. But the important thing for us is that we're technologically advanced and scientifically sophisticated enough that we can actually measure things as they're unfolding in real time and develop dynamic strategies that are reflective of the trends we're seeing in operation today. So put another way, we're entering this new era afforded by experimentation and looking now at what's happening on the ground, allowing us to pave our way into the future.
Dr. Barr, thank you for spending some time with us. And I've read a lot of your work, and I wish I'd been a student in your class when I was growing up, because I think I would have enjoyed university more than I did. But thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Tony.
The great takeaway that I've from Dr. Barr is really this sense of how do you approach this revolution? It's happening. These forces of change are powerful, they're relentless. And I think it's just that mindset that says, I'm going to embrace it and be part of this. I'm going to ride the wave of change versus being run over it. And I think that's really where scientific process and behavioral economics takes the guesswork out and really helps us come to terms as a collaborative culture saying, this is the best path forward. Coming up, we've got Shelby Sutherland on creating equity and diversity and inclusion programs that not just sound good, but actually change behavior. And then we're going to have Dr. Shannon O'Malley is going to talk about busting some corporate myths. Coming up right now.
Here's an essential question. How do we drive equity in the workplace using scientific insights and methods? In her talk, Creating Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Programs that Change Behavior, Dr. Shelby Sutherland will share how the best intentioned efforts can fail or even backfire, and will review how a BE approach shows you where to start and how to minimize failures. Shelby's an associate at BEworks and passionate about sharing the science of equity, diversity, and inclusion with leaders. Shelby's a development scientist who has studied the origins and stability of cognitive biases, including how we think about people and groups. She holds a PhD in development psychology from the University of Illinois and was a Banting postdoctoral fellow at the University of Toronto. She's used her expertise to help companies and governments around the world apply the science of behavior change to create more equitable policies and programs. Please welcome Dr. Shelby Sutherland.
Equity, diversity, and inclusion. People don't have great reactions to these terms. These terms make people feel anxious, overwhelmed, exhausted. And yes, it is a complex challenge, but there's an approach that can help us make much needed progress. Behavioral science gives us that approach. So far with the typical approaches, we've been missing the mark. It's not just about making sure we have enough people of particular genders or race. It's not about making sure that everyone goes through diversity training. It's not just about removing the names from resumes or developing algorithms to scan applications. Today, I'm going to talk about the typical approaches that aren't doing enough, and then I'll outline steps on how to take a behavioral science approach. I'm going to talk about 3 typical approaches, but there's one main takeaway. We need to recognize that bias can exist in solutions that are meant to de-bias. The first typical approach that I want to talk about is diversity training or de-bias training. Evidence suggests that it doesn't facilitate change. Maybe it's not a problem with diversity training in general. Maybe it's that we haven't designed them in the most ideal way, or we haven't implemented them in the most ideal way. With this in mind, some of the leading scientists in this area have developed their own training. Now, if there were to be an effective diversity training, I would place all of my bets on this one. They developed it and tested it in a global organization with over 3,000 of its employees. They found overall, on average, some attitude change among its employees, but no evidence of behavior change. Not even the top-tier diversity training program was able to drive behavior change. And that's why this approach falls under the category of typical approaches that aren't doing enough. Attitude change is nice, but we need behavior change to drive equity, diversity, and inclusion. Another common approach is blinding resumes. By blinding, I mean taking off the names and other identifying information that could bias someone's evaluation of the candidate. Now, yes, blinding resumes or applications can reduce bias. But remember, bias can still exist in solutions that are meant to de-bias. In fact, blinding applications has even been shown to backfire. In one study, they blinded applications in an attempt to increase the number of women being selected for senior leadership positions. And instead, they found that the blinded applications resulted in fewer women being selected. Perhaps when evaluators saw no names, they put their guards down and stopped looking out for other areas of bias that might come into play. And the last approach that I want to talk about that isn't doing enough is the use of algorithms in AI. Several companies have tried to take the human out of the decision-making process, and in turn hoping to remove the bias with it. The issue is that people create the algorithms, and the data that's used to train the models can be biased. A very large tech company experienced this problem firsthand. Their AI recruiting tool used past decisions to train itself to ultimately prefer male candidates. Now, I'm not saying that diversity training, blinding resumes, leveraging AI are bad things to do. They just aren't doing enough. And the reason is bias can exist in solutions that are meant to de-bias. Here are where some of those negative feelings around equity, diversity, and inclusion can come into play. This evidence can leave us feeling hopeless. And again, it isn't easy, but it's possible to improve at a much needed faster pace if we follow the behavioral science approach. First, we need to consider the psychological and behavioral barriers by all of the different players involved, and then accurately measure them and how tackling those barriers drive key outcomes. Then we can use this information to develop behavior-based strategies. If we know the barriers and the outcomes, then we can go to the scientific literature to help us develop strategies that are evidence-based. Now, these strategies, they're going to need to be multi-pronged. We're not going to find a magic pill that's going to take care of all of the barriers and biases and outcomes that we want to drive. Different groups may need different approaches, so we need to think about strategy development as having multiple prongs, multiple stages, coming at the challenge from different directions. And then we need to conduct scientifically rigorous experiments in your particular context. Strategies that have worked in one context might backfire in another. Through experimentation, we can also learn what parts of the different strategies are working and why. This helps you know which parts of the strategies are worth scaling up and which can be left behind. Now, if this is the goal, where do we start? We start with data-driven diagnostics. This data-driven diagnostics needs to be done across the different stages of the life cycle of an employee, starting with applications, moving into evaluating and hiring, then to people management and retention, and then promotion. Starting with applications, figure out who's applying, or more importantly, who's not applying. Are there biases in how applicants see their fit with the job? Certain language in job ads and requirements can dissuade underrepresented individuals. Language that suggests that jobs require genius or brilliance or an it factor have been shown to dissuade underrepresented individuals from applying. In fact, research shows that this effect is so ingrained, children as young as 6 will choose not to engage in activities with this given language. Equity, diversity, and inclusion programs, they tend to focus on the psychology and behavior of individuals that are part of the majority group. But equally important is the psychology and behavior of individuals of the underrepresented groups. Moving from application into evaluation and hiring, rather than identifying what the best credentials might be, what we need to do is measure what's required to succeed at the job. We do this at BEworks internally, and we've developed measures for sales positions through hire metrics. Now, people management and retention. We've developed measures for factors shown to improve employee well-being and in turn retention and employee performance. These include psychological safety and a sense of belonging. This diagnostic tool that we've developed can be used to apply data-driven diagnostics for current employees. We can identify the key areas that you need to focus on so that the solution development is based on evidence and so that the solutions are more likely to make an impact on your overall equity, diversity, and inclusion goals. Finally, promotion. Again, all I want to say here is measure what's required to succeed at the job. Now, coming back, data-driven diagnostics overall. Doing this across the employee life cycle is key. To do this, you need to accurately measure the barriers and your ultimate goals and outcomes. Then your solution development can be based on that evidence. Your solutions and strategies are going to need to be multi-pronged. Your diagnosed challenges are not going to be addressed by a magic pill because bias can exist in solutions that are meant to de-bias. The strategies are going to have to come at the issues from multiple directions across different time points. Because, as was true with the examples that I described, well-intentioned solutions can backfire. So test small, measure the impact, and with that evidence, you can make a business case to scale up your strategies with more confidence. The challenge is complex. There isn't a single solution. But with the approach provided to us by behavioral science, we can make change.
Our next guest is Dr. Shannon O'Malley, and the question she answers is, what are some common misperceptions about consumer behavior, and how do these misperceptions influence our decisions? Her talk's titled Busting Corporate Myths, and Dr. Shannon O'Malley, director of BEworks Academy, will discuss how a deep understanding of behavioral science can help your team challenge their own assumptions and make better decisions. Knowing insights to the science of behavior can better align hypothesis with reality, but understanding how to think like a scientist is a game changer because it improves critical thinking and provides new means to test ideas. As director of BEworks Academy, Shannon oversees the development and execution of workshops, online education courses, and practitioner-led courses. Shannon has applied behavioral science to solve challenges in a variety of sectors and has led numerous complex and impactful behavioral change initiatives, financial services, transit, marketing, and beyond. She's also developed and taught advanced level courses in psychology and behavior at the Rotman School of Management and the University of Toronto and at the University of Waterloo. Please welcome Dr. Shannon O'Malley.
Today I want to talk about how our misperceptions about human behavior and our underlying assumptions can influence our decisions and how sometimes they can lead us astray. And ultimately, we'll talk about how a scientific lens can help us make better decisions. I want to start with a couple examples from popular culture of myths that might influence you and the decisions that you're already making. So for example, do you think we only use a fraction of our brains at a time? Or do you think it takes 10,000 hours to become an expert or master practitioners at something? Or maybe you think that we learn better if taught through our preferred learning styles. Now, all of these examples are myths. At least they're not supported by current research. Now, none of these examples might influence your day-to-day work, but it begs the question, how do these types of myths or underlying assumptions influence you and your organizations and the decision that you're making? Let's think about an example. Do you think that your customers want flexibility and control over the products or services that you're offering? It might depend a little bit on the type of product or service that you're offering, but by and large at BEworks, this is a common assumption or common hypothesis that we hear from our clients. They really feel that customers want that flexibility and control over the types of products that they're being offered. But I want to give an example from a project that we did recently from an insurance company. Now, this is an insurance company who wanted to increase the uptake of offers that were presented on their website. So what typically happens here is a customer comes online to the website, enters in a little bit of information about what they're looking for, and an offer is presented. And in this case, in the control condition, 3 offers were presented side by side. 1 was recommended, and they were presented as a comparison chart so that people could see the difference between the offers. Now, we tested a number of different conditions, but I want to focus on one of those conditions. And it's what we call the DIY option, or the do-it-yourself option. And in this case, we still presented clients with 3 offers, but the 3rd offer was a do-it-yourself condition. So here they could go through and actually enter the parameters of the insurance that they wanted and use sliding charts to adjust some of the details of this. Now, why did we think this would work? Well, first, our clients were very excited about this idea because they had the underlying belief that their customers wanted flexibility and control over their insurance products. And we thought it would work because of something called the IKEA effect. Now, what is the IKEA effect? It's exactly kind of what it sounds like, which is we overvalue things that we have a hand in building. So if you think about IKEA furniture, you value that desk you built yourself versus a desk of similar quality that you might have purchased from another store. An example of this comes from the research in which researchers gave one group of people a Lego car that was already pre-built, and they gave another group of people a stack of Lego with instructions to build the car. And the participants had to actually build that car themselves. After both groups spent an equal amount of time with those Lego cars, they asked them, how much would you be willing to spend? How much would you be willing to pay to take this Lego car home with you today? And overwhelmingly, people in the build it yourself condition were willing to pay more than people who were in the just receive the car condition. And we thought that that would translate to this insurance product. We thought that that would translate into this context in which people have a product that they really have the opportunity to have some level of input on. But what did we find? That do-it-yourself condition underperformed relative to the control. So it actually had a backfire effect. Now, there's a number of different explanations we can look to for why this happened. But fundamentally, what we found is that our initial hypothesis was not true. It was unfounded. Now, if our underlying assumptions about behavior can lead us astray, that begs the question, how do we get it right? How do we get it right in the first place? Now, in the insurance example I just gave, and in some of the myths that I gave earlier, we can see that the scientific method is fundamental in our understanding of what is true and what is not true, what assumptions hold up in particular contexts, and what assumptions don't hold up in other contexts. But we don't always have that option available to us. We can't always test every single condition. So what are things that you can start to do within your organization to help you identify these types of assumptions and know when you should maybe be a little bit more skeptical about how they're influencing your behavior? The first one is to start asking, how do you know? When somebody makes a statement like, I think our customers want flexibility, or I think our customers want control, ask how we know that. What is that assumption that is stated as if it's a fact based on? And start to identify a hierarchy of evidence so that you know when you should be a little bit more skeptical or you might be a little bit more confident in that assumption. Next is to start documenting your predictions. Now, why does this matter? Well, in order for us to get better and to identify whether our assumptions are right or wrong, we have to really be able to look at the evidence to correct our assumptions as to whether or not they're right or wrong. And if we don't document our predictions, we're subject to the hindsight bias. So when we look at the outcomes, we may overwhelmingly interpret those outcomes as in line with our initial beliefs, when in fact they really weren't. And so documenting our predictions can help us overcome this and actually help us increase our expertise over time. Now, the final tip that you can start doing today is to try and prove yourself wrong. This is a fundamental principle of the scientific method. And when we're designing experiments, we design experiments to try and prove our hypothesis wrong. But we can start to do this even with our own assumptions and even when we're trying to make decisions. So when you're thinking about whether or not evidence supports your belief or not, think about the type of evidence you would need to counter your belief and look to see if you can find that evidence as well. And that will really start to help you challenge your own assumptions, challenge the assumptions within your organization. What's critical here is that applying behavioral economics isn't just memorizing a set of facts. At BEworks, this is a challenge we run into a lot, which is our clients come to us asking for simple insights and solutions that they can apply to their challenge. But the reality is applying behavioral economics isn't just memorizing facts, and it isn't just memorizing the same context, the same solution to another context. It really requires a deep understanding of the scientific process, and that leads to a different way of solving challenges. And the more people you have on your team who can take this scientific approach, who can challenge assumptions, the better your overall decision-making will be within your organization.
You know, I was in the agency business. I always believed in this concept of head, heart, and hands. You can understand how people think and feel and behave. You had the inside track in being impactful. You could find a way to help them get to where they want to go. But it was a lot of guesswork, a lot of just intuition. And I wish I'd met BEworks when I was in the heyday of my agency world. And I'm not doing this as a plug. I'm just saying that to have this concept of a scientific process, to have people that have the courage to try to prove their own hypothesis wrong, I think it's just an extraordinary way to approaching solving problems. Because very often when I got involved with research and I was peering over the window at a focus group and watching people devour that bowl of M&Ms, I just wanted people to validate my ideas. I wanted people to validate my strategies. I wanted permission to move forward. And I think that today, with less is more, with dollars being so precious, with really having to have a better approach. I mean, take diversity and inclusion. I used to just think, do what you say what you mean, that's all you needed. But to listen and to hear that sometimes it actually works against you. You really need to think these things through. You really need to test and validate and understand. But when you do, and when you've removed those biases and these conclusions come at you, what an opportunity it is to amplify with conviction and with confidence. The next section we're going to go into after the break is this section called Shaping the Future of Consumer Behavior. I'm going to begin with a fireside chat with Michael Birkin. Michael's Kelly's partner, part of the Q Collective. And when you hear about this band of rogue creative agencies that have come together, it's just an extraordinary what he's doing and how he views BE and behavioral economics as the liquid, the oxygen that can breathe life. And it's so much of the movements, as he'll talk about taking people to the edge. Dr. Pierre-Jean Mallet is going to talk about the future of cities. And man, I love getting in my own chariot and driving myself to work, but he's going to make a compelling case on how we have to change the way people behave when it comes to mass transit, to change the way people behave in terms of how we appreciate that there's a finite amount of streets and an infinite amount of bikes and buses and cars trying to access them. Dr. Ada Lee is going to how to close this concept of the say-do gap that Kelly introduced up front, the sense of, yeah, of course I'm environmentally conscious. And yes, of course I take care of my food waste. I put it in compost bin, but are you part of the solution? And she'll talk about some ways that behavioral economics can really close that gap and that intent becomes intentional. And then David Lewis and Michelle Hilscher are going to talk about building trust again. They're going to use a case study with advisors, but just a sense of, I've lost trust in a lot of society, and how can we find a way to reclaim trust so that we can help consumers get to where they want to go? We'll be back in 5 minutes with my fireside chat with Michael Birkin. We'll see you soon.
am pleased to introduce Michael Birkin as the keynote speaker for our next section devoted to the future of the consumer. Michael's the CEO of Q, which is a collective of strategically curated companies that include the likes of IDEO, BEworks, SY Partners, Godfrey Daddick, and many other impressive global firms. In his talk titled Reshaping the Future of Humanity by Rethinking the Consumer, Michael's going to share his perspectives on how we need to rethink the role of the consumer. Michael believes that businesses must, more than ever, understand the complexities of human experience and how best to harness it towards societal progress. Together, we'll explore whether seeing people as consumers serves the goal or is now a new reimagining in the order. Michael began his marketing career as CEO of brand consultancy Interbrand. He also founded Red Peak Group, was the CMO of Acer before creating Q with Hakuhodo Holdings of Japan. Stay tuned for my fireside chat with Michael following this talk.
Michael, welcome. How are you?
Hello, Tony. I'm very well. I'm in Dubai this evening, so I hope you can hear me okay.
I can hear you. It's trying to chase you around the world. It's like catch me if you can. You must be the 7 million mile club. But listen, we appreciate you joining us. And I want to begin, before we really get into the essence of the talk about your feeling about reshaping how we frame the consumer, I have to tell you, you came on my radar years ago when you were running Interbrand. You came up with this whole idea of creating a value for a brand. And I don't know if that initially was just an idea to create some attention, but it became this global force. I mean, we looked every year to see how you rank brands. So first of all, tell me what was the motivation for doing it and what were you hoping to achieve by putting a value on a brand beyond assets?
Well, it was desperation, actually, Tony. We were probably about 6 weeks from going out of business as a naming company, and we really had to do something. I was a pretty young CEO back then, talking about the mid-'80s. And one day I was just reading a piece in the Lex column in the Financial Times and saw that Nestle were taking over the UK confectionery company Rowntree's, and the reason they were paying such a premium over net assets was because of the value of the brands. And it occurred to me that somebody one day would come up with a system for doing that, and I felt we probably had as good a chance as any. And so we very quickly developed a methodology, and I managed to sell it into a major UK PLC, and then it really took off. But it was born out of necessity. I mean, we really would not have survived as a company had we not come up with it. But I think it was the importance of it, even though I didn't know it at the time, was that for the first time it brought finance people and the financial community into the world of advertising and marketing. I think prior to brand valuation, the financial community, certainly chief financial officers and their teams, would regard marketing as just a black hole where you just poured money and nobody knew whether it made any sense or not. And for the first time, by putting significant values on these assets, because they are significantly valued, it changed the dynamic. And that was the lasting benefit of that initiative, I think.
You could argue that your initiative and just this whole new mindset of CFOs and CEOs valuing the goodwill with their brand, the intrinsic value, that added hundreds of billions of dollars to balance sheets. And that was really when brands, like people define themselves, I'm young, I drink Pepsi, and I'm Americana, I drink Coca-Cola. But today I look around the marketplace and it seems that a lot of brands are relying more on selling on value versus their intrinsic value. Do you think there's still room for brands to stand out and stand for something where consumers are willing to pay a premium for it?
Well, I hope so. Otherwise, I'm going to go out of business pretty quickly, I think. You're right, Tony. I mean, I think that the Gen Z do look at the world very differently, and I do think that value has perhaps become more important. But I still believe in branding. You have to call things by a name. That name connotes or denotes a series of values. And those are values that can be enhanced by good new product development and the right communications. And I don't believe fundamentally that has changed, even though in specific situations, and you've just described one perhaps, it has.
So let's talk about Kelly Peters at BEworks, because they're a stellar example of someone that is really, with conviction and confidence, really going after some of the meaty problems you're talking about. When you partnered with them, as I read, you talked a lot about behavioral economics as being this oxygen that could breathe life into a lot of opportunities. Tell me a little bit about why behavioral economics is to your mind, one of your superpowers. Keep on the comic book analogy.
Well, if I had one word to answer the question, which I don't have, there is one word, it's depth is the word. I think that the major issue that a company like Q has in fulfilling its aspirations to tackle the world's biggest problems and not let McKinsey or Accenture get them all, is we have to demonstrate that we're not just from a traditional creative mindset, but there's actually depth in the quality of our thinking and in the support for the decisions and the solutions that we create. That's not easy to do when you come from a sort of advertising marketing background, a design background even, although I would always argue at the risk of being stoned by a lot of people in my profession that designers by definition have a depth that many others don't have. So I'm afraid I don't need, design is a bit of an exception in the pantheon of creative services in that sense. But the fact of the matter remains that to persuade very senior people to spend a lot of money in solving problems, you need to demonstrate a depth in your approach. People, even the most adventurous people, need a degree of reassurance. I'm not always sure that the advertising profession per se has always been able to demonstrate that. One or two maybe, but not many. So to me, behavioral economics was a fairly obvious way to go to actually create that support, to be able to challenge thinking and to provide evidence behind why something makes sense. And it's not an easy thing to do. I mean, behavioral economics is a science. It's defined as a science. Scientific thinking is very different from much artistic thinking. But the great moves that have ever been made, in my opinion, in society, whether you're talking about Italy in the 15th century or Florence in the 15th century specifically, or Paris in the 18th century is another example, has been this confluence of art and science. And that has to happen this century if a creatively led organization is going to have the right to serve major institutions on big problem solving and have more than just the right, but actually can deliver what it needs to deliver. So to me, it was not just a nice to have, it was an absolute essential. And we had to be the organization that would pioneer the way in which behavioral economics would increasingly become a part and second nature to artistic and creative thinking.
So, Michael, I love the way you framed, points in history where creativity and science came together and we saw this renaissance. And I know you're a massive collector and thought leader in Renaissance art, so you've studied that period. Talk to me about, you talked about reframing the corporation so they embody the sense of scientific process and thinking, behavioral economics. But part of what we want you to talk about today is you've come out with a fairly bold statement that got a lot of attention when you said, maybe it's time that we reframe the consumer and really rethink what this concept of consumerism is all about. Can you spend a few minutes to share with us what your thesis is and why do you feel it's something that would matter to our audience?
Well, Tony, I mean, what I'm about to say is not my own, it's my own thinking only because I've been given it, and or not just given it, but being very happy to adopt it. But one of the things that I inherited when I decided that I would do this with Takehodo DY in Japan was I adopted a philosophy that pervaded HDY for well over 50 years. The organization is over 100 years old. But for the second half of the 20th century, the philosophy that pervades Takehodo's way of thinking is a Japanese philosophy called Seikatsu Sha, which is not an easy philosophy to describe in English, but it essentially means that you look at people as human beings and not as consumers. The word consumer is not a word that I like, if you think about it, and user is another one that's sometimes used as its proxy. They're both horrible words if you actually think about what they literally mean. Seikatsu Sha is essentially a way of cutting through human beings and not looking at them as just users or consumers of what it is that you're doing, but essentially as human beings, as 360-degree people, and looking at the way they think, the way they love, the way they nurture, or the way they're nurtured, what they eat, what they wear, and the way they live their lives. And it pervades not just a way of looking at them, but actually a whole spirit around partnership with people. So the way of creating in a Seikatsu Sha environment is around, the Japanese describe it as a well, like a well where you get water and everybody congregates around it and essentially creates something because of that congregation, as opposed to the classic way of marketing, which is, they call it the river model, where you look at people on the other side of a river and essentially it's potluck whether you nail what it is you're meant to be doing in your message and the dissemination of the message. And so that philosophy actually underpins our whole thinking about consumers, if we have to use that word, or we need to use that word, because humanity is written in to the very way we think about the people that we're trying to address. And that essentially has been with us from the start of Q, and is the way that we look at a 21st century consumer, because the philosophy, if anything, is more valid now than it was in the 1950s when it essentially was adopted by my organization.
Michael Birkin, it's been an honor getting to know you over the last couple of weeks and reading some of your thinking. And, the real takeaway for people listening, one is, this is a person that has great humility. I mean, right away, I had no choice. We were 6 weeks away from going bankrupt. By creating this interbrand strategy, the real magic wasn't so much building business. It was bringing other people to the table, bringing the CEOs and the CFOs. I think the fact that you're creating something for the future, but roots to the past, is a great second lesson in life that we discard. But the fact that you're moving forward, and that's part of your knapsack. And the third thing is just the way you talk with such pride, not only about the partners that are out there pushing the edge, as you said, but creating something that will be quite historic. It's been a pleasure to have you with us, and wherever you're going next, safe travels.
Thank you, Tony. And I've thoroughly enjoyed getting to know you a little too. So let's hope we can do this again, as long as it's not too tedious for everybody else.
That's a promise. Very much. So coming up now, we're going to continue this whole quest. I talked about uncharted territories. Dr. Pierre-Jean Mallet is going to talk about the future of transportation. Such a powerful talk. Finite amount of streets, infinite amount of people attacking him. What is the answer? It lies in behavioral economics. Dr. Ada Lee on understanding how to close the say-do gap. This sense of, I'm this, but do I really live by it? Do I practice it? And Michelle Hilscher and David Lewis, and I've known David for years, and the future of money, recreating trusts, rebuilding the currency between consumers and organizations and institutions. More to come, and then we're going to wrap up with a live panel. The chat lines are open, flood them, and we'll be right back after this break.
Our next speaker is Pierre-Jean Mallet. The question he answers is, can we design the cities of the future using a behavioral science lens? In his talk, leveraging the psychology of urban transportation to reclaim cities, Dr. Mallet will explore this question and shed light on how psychology of transit can in fact shape the cities of the future. His belief is that efficient, sustainable transportation systems are key to providing a better quality of life for city dwellers and for protecting the environment. Behavioral science provides a framework to study and apply the psychology of transit and facilitate the transition from solo driving to multimodal transit. More broadly, this talk will show the potential of behavioral science to help shape some of the most fundamental aspects of our lives to better align with how we think, feel, and act. Dr. Mallet holds a PhD in evolutionary biology from the University of Toulouse. He's conducted his postdoctoral research in cheating and cooperation at the University of Toronto, Harvard University, and the Max Planck Institute. Pierre-Jean's work on the symbiotic relationship between ants and plants provides surprisingly useful groundwork for his work at BEworks on the perception of value of services in the transportation, healthcare, and finance industries. Please welcome Dr. Pierre-Jean Mallet.
What if I could give you back one day every year? What would you do with this extra day? You could spend it with your family, go on a shopping spree, or even spend the day on your couch watching Netflix. You could do whatever you want, but what I am sure of is that you wouldn't choose to spend your extra day sitting in your car looking for parking. And yet, American drivers spend an average of 17 hours per year searching for parking. That search costs each driver around $345 in wasted time, wasted gas, and emissions. And if you live in New York City, it's even worse. You're spending almost 5 days per year in your car searching for parking at the whopping cost of $2,243. The main cause for this tremendous waste is solo driving. But not only solo drivers pay the cost, everybody does. Drivers spend time and money buying, maintaining, and driving cars. Cities experience higher road maintenance costs due to congestion. Local economic activity is slower because of customers avoiding trips due to the challenge of finding parking. Urbanites are exposed to air and noise pollution that create health hazards, and employers must solve and pay for high demand and parking space. And despite all these costs and the frustration, we choose to own a car and drive alone. What is wrong with us? A large developer came to us with this exact question. They wanted to understand why people own cars. It's easy to develop hypotheses about why we own cars. Basically, we can think about two categories: lifestyle reasons and planning reasons. Lifestyle reasons could be because we like driving, because being a driver is part of our identity, or because driving represents freedom. Planning reasons might seem more practical. To be able to leave home at the last minute and still arrive on time at work, to go on an impromptu weekend in a backcountry, to drive the teenagers to hockey practice with all their equipment, or to be able to bring back this cute little 5-drawer chest from IKEA. As you can see, we could just ask people directly and there would be no shortage of explanation, some very specific and idiosyncratic. But actually, it would be difficult to identify commonalities to operationalize, and most importantly, could we trust the answers? We're notoriously terrible at knowing what we want. Wouldn't we all want to exercise more? And we are even worse at understanding why we act the way we do. We tend to rationalize and justify our actions with the reasons that seems more elegant instead of the real reason. It feels better to say that we want a car to shelter our kids from the weather rather than admitting that we just want to show off with our brand new SUV. So we probed into the psychology of car owners. Instead of asking directly, why do you own a car? We presented car owners with different options for alternative modes of transportation, and we asked them to pick the one option that had the higher potential to convincing them to give away their car. Each aspect of each option was carefully crafted to reflect a cognitive bias related to transportation. Some options were strong on lifestyle aspects, some others were stronger on planning aspects, and some were mixed. By making choices iteratively between these options, car owners revealed their preferences for some aspects without having to rely on introspection. And what do you think happened? What do you think is the main reason for people to own a car? It was not a lifestyle reason. It's a planning reason. And the psychological mechanism behind the attachment that we feel to our car is uncertainty aversion. We want to have a car to know exactly when we will leave, how long it will take, what route we will take, and at what time we will arrive. And of course, we want to have a car just in case we need emergency transportation. We really believe that we have more control over our life when we own a car, and that provides us peace of mind. People prefer 100% perceived reliability of cars over 99% reliability of bus. But this perception of reliability of cars is actually the result of several cognitive biases. To give you some examples, we can talk about the illusion of control. We think that we can control speed when behind the wheel. The confirmation bias. We only hear about transit delays, never about days where transit system runs smoothly. Or the overestimation bias. We overestimate mechanical reliability and safety of cars, and as a result, we underestimate the probability of the car breaking down. So, now that we know what psychological benefits car owners derive from their car, how can we convince them that they can get peace of mind from other modes of transportation? What is a better way than getting them to try? But again, there are a bunch of psychological barriers in the way to the first ride. And they are mostly related to habits. First, there is only one decision point in the morning that will condition our behavior during the rest of the day. Second, at this decision point, we can be cognitively depleted. It's early in the morning, maybe even before the first coffee. It's easier to default back to the known experience. On top of that, it is so much easier to procrastinate. I'll try tomorrow. And finally, but very importantly, there are sunk costs. We spend a lot of money buying this car. We have to drive it to justify the purchase. These barriers prevent experimentation, even when it could be beneficial to us and improve our lives. Let's take the example of a natural experiment. In 2014, the London subway went through 2 days of strike and was partially shut down. After the strike, 6% of the commuters did not return to using their usual route. And it is not because they stopped using public transportation. During the shutdown, they were forced to experiment with new routes, and they ended up discovering a better way to go where they wanted to go. This is the perfect illustration of what scientists describe as exogenously imposed constraints that helped agents to get closer to their optimum by triggering a period of experimentation, innovation, and re-optimization. What it means is that a little bit of experimentation, once in a while, allows to discover new, better ways of conducting familiar activities. And what is the better time to experiment? When we're feeling that we're having a fresh start. And what's a better example of a fresh start than a new job? Imagine that you're starting a new job at a new company. Imagine your first day. You're being shown around, meeting your new colleagues, your new desk, the coffee machine. And as part of the onboarding, you're being presented with a concrete multimodal commute plan. You need to leave your place at 8:15 a.m., drive for 12 minutes to the Eglinton subway station, take the line 4, get out at Central Station, walk for 4 minutes, and you will arrive on time at work. And weather permitting, you can choose to bike instead of driving to the subway station. Even easier, you're being matched with 2 of your colleagues who live nearby and can drive you every day. And you know what? Tomorrow is try day at the company. So why don't you just give it a try? The goals of this strategy: reducing uncertainty by providing actionable solutions, a concrete plan, and piggybacking on a clean slate or a fresh start to trigger changes of habits. The outcome is a win-win for employers and employees. Less demand for parking space that needs to be paid for and maintained by companies. On the other hand, better quality of life for employees. Great! Now we know how to nudge people towards trying a first ride on carpooling or public transit. But if we want the change to stick beyond this first ride, the initial experience needs to be pleasant. And as we saw earlier, making transit pleasant means solving for uncertainty. A transportation company reached out to improve passenger experience on the subway. Our solution, as always, reducing uncertainty. In other words, providing clarity about what is needed and what is expected. Let's take a very simple example. You entered the subway station and are now walking towards the platform. Small colorful arrows on the floor pointing towards the train indicate where you should stand to wait before boarding. Small colorful arrows pointing in the opposite direction indicate where passengers will walk when exiting the train. Does something as cheap and as simple as stickers really work? Well, we all saw it with COVID. We don't have to think about physical distancing. We just stand on the sticker without thinking about anything. And that's the key. Such very subtle cue in the environment provides immense comfort to our brains. It relieves cognitive load and allows us to bask in the glory of absolute certainty. Certainty that what we're doing is what is expected from us. Certainty that we're doing what is socially acceptable. Certainty that what we're doing is just right. In the context of public transportation, the extra psychological comfort that is provided to users has immense positive spillover. Practically speaking, it improves passenger flow and reduces delay. It also decreases friction and overall creates a smoother, more pleasant experience. We usually expect users and drivers to bear the full responsibility to change their behavior. Drivers must reflect on why we solo drive and try to experiment. Users must behave in better ways. But behavioral sciences show that our cars, our streets, our buses, our companies, we are all part of one urban ecosystem. And we all have our part to play. City planners and developers, they can provide value to urbanites by organizing living spaces around multimodal transportation instead of cars. Service providers, such as ride-sharing or transit companies, they can solve for uncertainty and increase mental comfort by providing cues to make the environment easy to read and navigate. And employers, they can provide value to their employees by organizing carpooling options, especially for new employees or at the time of promotions. We go to great length to shield ourselves from uncertainty. But if there is one thing that we can be sure of, it's that when it comes to imagining the transportation of the future, or just planning tomorrow's subway ride, we cannot and we do not travel the journey alone. Thank you.
Our next guest is Dr. Ada Lee, Vice President at BEworks, and the question she answers is, what are the pitfalls of market research and how do we overcome them? The title of her talk is Lessons for the Field to Overcome the Say-Do Gap. At BEworks, Ada oversees innovative projects in healthcare, financial services, retail, and more. This broad expertise and strategic oversight gives her a unique perspective on how organizations can more deeply and accurately understand consumer needs. Ada holds a PhD in cognitive neuroscience from the University of Toronto, was a postdoctorate fellow at York University prior to joining BEworks. Her award-winning research has been published in top-tier scientific journals on a array of topics including attention, integration, and decision-making. Looking into the mechanism that drives behavior change, Ada has adopted a wide range of research methods throughout her career, including neuroimaging to motion tracking. Ada now brings her expertise in the integration of research methods to help companies and organizations solve real-world challenges all over the world.
What if I told you that the way we've been thinking about voice of the customer research is wrong? What if I told you that one of its biggest flaws is that it fools us into thinking that we know our customers way better than we actually do? And that although this type of research may feel good, it can ultimately lead us astray. Now, depending on who you are and what you do, my statements are probably making you feel quite uneasy. We have a proposed solution. Through more than a decade of solving real-world challenges, we have come to learn that we can overcome the shortcomings of traditional voice of the customer research by integrating it with behavioral science methods. This is the future. Let's start our journey together by talking about beer. Yes, beer. Now, a few years ago, we worked with one of the world's largest multinational alcoholic beverage companies. They were preparing for the launch of an in-home draft beer device. So essentially, this was a machine that dispenses beer on tap in people's homes. What they wanted to understand were two things. Number one, how should they market this device? And number two, when the device is in people's homes, how will they use it? How can we get them to use it more often? The machine, of course, is of noble cause. A machine like this would effectively reduce hundreds of billions of cans that are produced globally each year. Now, sadly, upon launch, the machine did not meet expectations. People either didn't buy it or they didn't use it. And what we learned is that people closeted the machine. After using it for a few times because it was fun and new, the machine then simply went straight into the closet, never seen nor heard again, out of sight, out of mind. This company didn't just blindly launch this new product, of course. They conducted a vast amount of research. One of their most memorable works was a series of focus groups where participants tested the machine, gave feedback on whether they buy and use it at home. The feedback was resoundingly positive. But upon further inspection, the feedback was problematic because people were getting progressively drunk as the session went on. This made people increasingly willing to say yes and respond positively to any questions asked of them. By the end, the company knew that there was a problem with how they were using the voice of the customer research. That is, they had been using it to do testing and to validate their plans, rather than to use it to make observations and hypotheses that are subsequently tested with a more systematic and rigorous approach. And the fact is, those of you who are familiar with voice of the customer research, you know the problems that can arise with this kind of research. The first set of problems are around simply asking people what they think. Some problems are group-based. Now, if the method involves collecting information through a group setting, you may be familiar with the issue of groupthink. That is, the tendency for a group of people to reach consensus about something without much critical thought. This is due to our desire for harmony and for conformity within a group. It can be really hard to go against the grain or become a naysayer. Related to this, you may face social desirability issues. That is, people want to look good in front of others, and this influences what people end up saying, even if they don't fully believe in it. Now, some other problems might be individual-based. People can have flaws in what they are able to remember, or their memory might be affected by availability biases, that is, what immediately comes to mind, or confirmation biases, that is, only attending to things that are consistent with their initial beliefs. Now, beyond problems with asking people what they think, there are problems with simply asking people what they will do. The biggest one of these is the say-do gap. How many of you actually follow through on doing all the things you say you will do? Exercise every night, eat better, save for retirement, recycle your old batteries? Now, dating back to as early as the 1930s, the say-do gap is arguably one of the most studied topics in behavioral science. And in brief, what we know is that the problem with asking people what they think they will do in the future is that we tend to be too optimistic about our future behavior. In fact, recent meta-analyses tell us that our intentions predict actual behavior less than 40% of the time. Now, this link between intention and action is even worse when the intention is for hypothetical imaginary scenarios or for a behavior that will occur in the far future. So, there we have it, challenges with the voice of the customer. It feels right, it feels good, and it feels logical to get the voice of the customer. But as researchers, we need to be aware of the biases inherent in this method. How do we overcome this problem? What we propose is this: pair voice of the customer research with behavioral science methods. At a glance, our behavioral science method includes 5 key steps. Let's very quickly go through these steps together. The first step is discovery. Get a lay of the land and understand the challenge. What is the behavior you're trying to change? And what do we already know about the challenge and the target customer? Now, this step could involve reviewing outputs from market research to help you understand what are the existing assumptions and hunches about the problem. And the key is this: voice of the customer can help you understand what is known and can help you inspire new ideas. And voice of the customer research is great as a hypothesis generator, but not so much as a hypothesis tester. In our beer machine example, the target behavior was to encourage people to purchase the machine and then use it on a weekly basis at home. So if you don't know much at this point in time about how people consume alcohol or what types of alcohol are most popular, conducting market research at this point in time is key. The next step is behavioral diagnostics. The focus here is to diagnose the why. Why are people behaving in the way that they are or they aren't? What biases and psychological barriers get in the way? What behavioral enablers exist? Critically, we need people to respond to scenarios that reveal their true preferences rather than just their stated needs. So now that you know what the barriers and the enablers are, we can dive into ideation. This is the third step. This is where we generate ideas on how to solve the challenge. And the question we want to answer is how? How do we overcome the barriers, such as the closeting effect? What hypotheses and interventions can we develop to change people's behavior? For our beer machine example, the question we asked was this: how do you break people's long-held habits around single-use products and encourage them to start using more sustainable, refillable containers? And what we know is that when we want people to overturn age-old habits, we need to make sure that they do not revert to former habits at the first sign of friction. For the beer machine, our diagnostic assessment indicated that the primary barrier was the status quo. People preferred to stick to their old ways of drinking beer and generally didn't know how to incorporate the new device into their beer drinking routine. So therefore, our goal was to create a new habit loop by replacing the beer in the refrigerator with the beer machine. And our idea was this: we need a way to disrupt the existing habit loop and help reinforce the new one. Our intervention was to piggyback on the device's companion app and then send push notifications to users. These notifications would essentially preemptively remind people about how much fun it would be to use the device for upcoming events, such as sports competitions or social gatherings. Now, in step 4, we test our ideas using randomized controlled experiments. In our example, 100 beer drinkers were randomly assigned to one of 3 conditions. In the experimental condition, participants were given the beer machine plus mobile notifications. And then to help us determine whether the notifications truly worked, we included 2 other conditions. One, a condition where participants only had the machine, no notifications. And a control condition where they did not have the machine, nor notifications. Now, people's beer consumption patterns were monitored over a 5-week period, both using daily self-report as well as tracking built into the device itself. What we found is that the notifications triggered spikes in in-home beer machine usage over the next 24 hours, as well as into the next evening. This indicated that having well-timed interventions effectively helped people incorporate the refillable machine into a new consumption routine. This example illustrates 2 key points. 1, to properly test ideas, we need to run experiments where different conditions are created and compared. This allows us to determine cause and effect. Did it work? And if it does, by how much and why? We need to go simply beyond capturing what people say they will do and really collect data that reflects people's actual behaviors. The last step is choice architecture. Knowing what you know now about what will change people's behavior, we can provide a recommendation about what should be implemented, what should not be, and why. And that's it. This is the end. And the key takeaway is very simple. Voice of the customer research methods need to be combined with behavioral science methods to mitigate risk. Voice of the customer research is very powerful upfront to help us understand a problem, but ultimately you need behavioral science methods to generate and test solutions that will solve the challenge itself. And while voice of the customer research has gained a lot of traction in the last 30 years, behavioral science research is now also gaining significant traction, with a 700% increase over the last 10 years in companies that use behavioral science. So join us in this movement, because more deeply understanding your consumer needs will help you design better solutions.
We're now joined by Dr. David Lewis and Dr. Michelle Hilscher. And the question they're going to answer is, how do we break through the say-do gap and get investors seek and follow professional advice? So we know that too few people ask and follow professional advice when making these complex, risky, consequential investment decisions. And as a result, their well-being suffers. So David and Michelle will explore the question of why people avoid seeking and following the advice of professionals. Professionals can improve their lives immeasurably given their experience and expertise. They'll consider the specific case of financial advice and what behavioral science reveals about the barriers and opportunities for financial advisors to help their clients make better decisions. David holds a PhD in consumer behavior, an MBA in finance and strategy, and is also a chartered financial analyst. David's held numerous senior positions, including head of technology, head of marketing, president, CEO, and chairman of the board at global financial institutions, including Barclays Wealth Management and UBS Financial. Ad Age magazine has also recognized David as being one of the top 50 marketers in the United States. David's research focuses on financial decision-making and financial advice, and he seeks to understand how we can encourage better outcome for investors. At BEworks, Dr. Michelle Hilscher oversees projects in several sectors, including financial services. Dr. Hilscher is always looking to help clients develop better ways of knowing and applying the scientific method. She holds a PhD from the University of Toronto, where she studied how pre-existing beliefs factor into judgment and decision-making around what is fact and what is fiction. This work is now the essence that she applies to help improve strategic decision-making by executives and financial decision-making by everyday people.
The onset of the COVID pandemic caused turmoil everywhere, including financial markets. For example, when markets dropped 33.8% from a peak on February 19th, 2020, to the trough on March 23rd, 2020, there was $335.6 billion pulled from U.S. equity markets in March. They missed out on the 17.6% recovery in the first 3 days after March 23rd. They also missed out on the continuing recovery that created an overall gain of 18% by year end. Many people suffered a permanent impairment of their ability to achieve financial and life goals due to these poor financial decisions. Unfortunately, this is a pattern that seems to repeat every time there's turmoil. For example, the global financial crisis of 2008, the internet bubble of 2000, the Asia financial crash of 1997, Black Monday, 1987, and on back to 1929, 1907, and before that. The question is, how can behavioral science reduce the likelihood of this occurring again?
The question of how to optimize investment decision-making is very important. It's important to the investments industry. It's important to regulators. It's important to investors themselves and also society in general. What we know is that financial well-being hinges on it, and so too does overall well-being. Researchers have actually documented that it's financial well-being that's the primary predictor of overall well-being, even when you're taking into consideration things like job satisfaction, relationship satisfaction, and physical health combined. So how do we actually get there? Although investing is something that's complex, it's risky, it's consequential, what we know, thankfully, is that financial advice is beneficial if only we could see people actually seeking it out and taking advantage of it. So what is the value that advice brings to the table? For one thing, it's more than support. So that's access to specialized knowledge, to expertise. And that's something that we know people actually naturally gravitate towards when they're able to admit to themselves that this is a problem that's complex and difficult and actually in an arena where they're not experts themselves. There's research that shows that people place more value very naturally into advice about life insurance than advice about investing. I suppose it makes sense. No one claims to dabble in underwriting. The value of advice is that it actually pays off. If you're looking at investors who are advised, you're looking at their portfolios, you'll see that those are more diversified, they have lower idiosyncratic risk, and that overall their accounts are outperforming those of the non-advised investors. Advice derives some of its value from the very fact that it leverages behavioral principles, and that's something that contributes to behavior change. Whether it's the status quo bias that has investors seeing a whole lot of value and there's being sticking power to the default recommendations that an advisor is providing to them, or it's perhaps something like behavioral coaching that helps investors actually take on more of a future-oriented way of thinking. Another thing that we know about behavioral coaching is that it can actually get in front of and preempt those negative behaviors that are all too common and expected when people are feeling anxious and negative emotions. The value exists, but we also know that people still remain reluctant to actually seek it out and put it to use. Research by the BEworks Research Institute has shown that it's only actually 13% of investors who have a financial advisor and would say that they actually are following through on recommendations. Other work that we've done shows that that implementation gap may actually be much larger. And that's because it all depends on the standard that you're applying. What does it mean to actually follow through on recommendations? There may be many boxes to check to say that you've done so. So who finds and extracts value and who doesn't? I suppose that's the type of question that could have us moving down the path of talking about things like demographic profiling, construction of consumer personas. Unfortunately, demographic segmentation is not really telling us much about behavior. In fact, it's dangerous. It can actually be misleading us into understanding investors. Traditional demographic-based approaches, they really need to be replaced by more nuanced and less biased approaches that are going to tell us about what investors do, not who investors are. Behavioral modeling and behavioral segmentation is what brings innovation and rigor like this to the table.
We need to take a scientific approach to understanding behavior. We recently analyzed attitudes and behaviors of 3,000 North American investors to create a behavioral model of seeking and following advice. Demographics, including age, sex, financial literacy, education level, marital status, household size, investable assets, and even investment time horizon, do not explain intention to seek advice, an attitude, or the actual behavior of subsequently following the advice. What we did find was that attitudes and behavioral biases did explain behavior. The strongest negative factor was higher subjective knowledge, what you think you know rather than what you actually know, also known as illusory explanatory depth, or having an illusion that you understand and can explain something when you really can't. High subjective knowledge, manifesting as illusory explanatory depth, leads people to devalue advice, have lower intention to seek advice, and then lower actual subsequent behavior of following advice, since they overestimate their own abilities and underestimate the contribution of a financial advisor. Think, for example, of GameStop and the other meme stocks. The strongest positive was trust, which increases intention to seek advice, but also subsequent behavior in following advice. We also found a strong say-do gap or intention gap, with intention to seek advice explaining only 40% of the actual subsequent behavior of following advice. And following advice is what really matters. Think of going to a gym, think of joining a gym, think of joining a gym and not going to the gym. And remember, age was not a factor. Therefore, knowing someone is a millennial is relatively useless, and any marketing strategy based on an age cohort, such as millennials or boomers, will not be effective. Instead, in order to encourage more people to seek and follow advice and therefore achieve better financial and life outcomes, we should focus on overcoming illusory explanatory depth by giving people a more realistic assessment of their skills and abilities, and also by pursuing strategies to increase trust. Behavioral modeling is critical, since without digging deeper, one might be tempted to assume that a lower price would make the appeal of financial advice greater. But this research also demonstrates that the effect of subjective knowledge and illusory explanatory depth and trust each have 3 times the impact of price on the decision to seek and subsequent behavior of following advice. We need behavioral insights based on science to understand consumer behavior. Insights such as these can help consumers become more aware of how and why they are making decisions, and hopefully improve their decisions in the future. Industry, regulators, consumer advocacy groups, policymakers and governments, and financial advisors can use these insights to develop more powerful and effective strategies to help consumers make better decisions and achieve better outcomes.
This research illustrates the merits of applying a science-based approach. That's going to help us better understand investors. And when we're using something like behavioral modeling and behavioral segmentation, you can see the impact when it comes to creating strategies that are actually going to change behavior. As practitioners, as strategists, as leaders, what we need to do is move away from demographic-based profiling. We need to actually recognize that, yes, it may be an easy and appealing heuristic, but it really doesn't have power to actually expand our understanding of behavior. Behavioral modeling, though, is what's going to lead to more powerful and also more rigorous insights. They're often insights that are actually quite counterintuitive. So David talked about the fact that, we can look at things like subjective knowledge and trust and pricing and ask the question of which of those actually predicts behavior, the willingness to take advice. And counter to what you might expect, what we're finding through behavioral modeling is that it's actually trust, it's actually subjective knowledge that are telling the story there, and it isn't what you'd expect, which might be pricing. That actually echoes work that we've done, looking to see what happens when investors have access to greater understanding of the fees that they pay for services like advice. We might have expected that that's going to mean they push away, that they don't want advice. And what we actually learn through these innovative methods is that having that knowledge has investors leaning in and actually wanting to take more advantage of those services. So that's something that helps them achieve their financial goals. And for us as strategists, it's helping us to really understand what's going on and challenge our assumptions. Behavioral modeling also is something that creates opportunities for behavioral segmentation, where we're starting to think about populations in a different way. It's not about who people are. It's not about thinking about the demographic differences. It's about splitting the population up and seeing what's different in terms of those behaviors. For instance, we've done extensive work looking at the implementation gap. The question that we looked at in a particular study was, why is it that clients don't actually follow through on recommendations contained in a financial plan that they've actually gone to the trouble of having prepared for them? The answer is not demographics. That's not what decides whether or not they follow through on advice. It's actually about where they're at in the journey and what are the behaviors that led up to the decision of whether to take action or not. Ultimately, the value of a science-based approach and behavioral modeling is that you bring more rigor to the table when you're answering questions, but you also open the questions up and make more room for innovation. Whether it's in the creation of imagined worlds or testing out hypothetical situations to see what do they actually do to behavior. It could be in how we democratize the process of idea generation and creativity in organizations. What we can tell you is that a science-based approach is the vehicle for rigor in innovation within organizations.
Well, at the beginning of the day, I talked about a quest going across a number of territories, and what a great session we just had. I just love this concept of changing how we think about automobiles and changing our behavior. And then what really opened my eyes is that so many times I've sat behind that glass at focus groups, as I said earlier, hoping that it would validate an idea and then get the market research would prove that I was right. And just how you can start looking at scientific process and behavioral economics to really remove those biases, to really get at the root. We're about to go into a break, and I was talking about territories. We're now going to start putting this all together in terms of what is next. How do we face the future? We're going to listen to an incredible conversation with Dr. David Pizarro, and he's going to talk really about actionable ideas, insights, and strategies. And I'm going to have a fireside chat with him. And then we're going to end the day with a great panel discussion by bringing back 4 of the people, including Kelly and Michael, and keep the chat lines live, because we're going to take some of your insights and ideas and incorporate it in a conversation. We'll see you back here in 5 minutes.
next section is Facing the Future. And to kick it off, Dr. David Pizarro asked one of the most important questions facing us in the future. What moral dilemmas might we face in a future when technology and machines go head-to-head with humans? David's talk is titled Facing the Future, Moral Psychology and Technological Resistance. In his talk, he will highlight technological innovations that are driving the development of consumer products and services, such as artificial intelligence, machine learning, algorithmic decision-making, and Dr. Pizarro will show how behavior science can help us understand the human impacts of these technologies. Dave is an associate professor of psychology at Cornell University and a chief science officer at BEworks since 2012. He's been an integral part of establishing the company's experimentation and data standards. In his academic career, he's considered a world-renowned expert on moral judgments and emotions. He studies how emotions like anger and disgust and fear impact how people process information, remember events, and make moral judgments of others. He's also dedicated his career in studying the interaction between people and machines, which is the focus of his keynote talk today. And stay tuned, because after his keynote, I hold a fireside chat with Dr. David Pizarro.
Hello. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. It's my pleasure to talk to you this afternoon. And what I want to talk about is, as the intro said, advances in technology and the barriers that they face. Not technological barriers, but rather psychological barriers. So we're seeing ever increasing gains from technological innovation. Many of these technologies have the potential to bring about great benefit to humankind. But while that innovation sometimes stumbles, again, because of technological barriers, I want to focus on some of the psychological barriers, namely our social and moral intuitions. These are being stretched by new technologies, and they're ill-equipped to handle the changing technological landscape. After all, technology advances at a far more rapid pace than we can adapt to. So, our psychology, our decision-making, our judgment, our intuitions, our emotions, is the product of a brain that evolved thousands of years ago under very different conditions, physical and social conditions. Our social and moral intuitions became fine-tuned to a social environment that was really different. We were in small-scale societies, maybe 100, 150 people. We were hunter-gatherers. But we're trying to use that brain to make decisions and judgments about things that we face today that never would have been faced by our ancestors. So in other words, we're using old technology to make new decisions. And to put it simply, we can't update the firmware on our brains. We're sort of stuck with the psychology that we have. And these very old intuitions can easily lead to a lack of adoption of beneficial new technologies and even to a stifling of innovation. At least that's what I want to argue. Now, I think beneficial technologies will always find a way to insert themselves into our society. But what I really want to talk about is the pace of innovation and how that might be improved if we take into account the human psychology that might be a barrier towards it. Before I get to some more serious examples, let me give you two examples of technological resistance that sort of led me down the path of being interested in this technological innovation and our psychology. The first comes from car manufacturers. So at some point, engineers at BMW became so good at what they did that their cockpit was entirely silent. That is, you would get into the car, start your engine, be going down the freeway, and you would hear nothing from your engine. Well, it turns out people didn't like this. They bought a BMW for a reason. One of those reasons might be to hear the engine. Moreover, they were used to knowing that the engine was working and how it was working by listening to the sounds. They were getting feedback from the engine. So rather than make the cockpit less sealed, BMW engineers developed an algorithm to pump fake engine noise into the cockpit. Now, that fake engine noise was very responsive to the conditions which the driver was driving under. So if the driver accelerated, the fake engine noise rumbled through the speakers of the car. So thousands, if not millions of dollars was put into this technology merely because the drivers were used to hearing engine noise. They did not want to adapt to this new technology. Okay, let me give you another example. This example comes from a conversation I had with the behavioral economist Sendhil Mullainathan. And when I was talking to him, he gave me this anecdote about Indian farmers. And when they were first introduced to tractors, up until then, they had been using oxen as beasts of burden to do their farming. Basically, they were their living tractors. Well, what the field researchers noted was that, even after a reluctant adoption of the tractors, the farmers would go every night out into the fields where the tractors were, and they would put a blanket over the tractor. So even when they were adopting a novel technology, they were doing something that might be a great thing for the oxen, but obviously had no beneficial impact for the tractor. Again, an example that people can fail to adopt innovative technology, or sometimes they can adopt it but use it in a way that's more congruent with the intuitions that they've already developed, maybe what they're used to from prior technologies. So these examples that I just gave you are examples of technological adoption troubles, barriers to technological adoption based on previous experience. So the experience of driving a car, the experience of using oxen for farming. But I want to talk about some of the deeper intuitions and how they might be affecting our judgment and our adoption of technology. So many psychologists believe that some of these social and moral intuitions are among the deepest that we have. They're part of the evolved human mind. These are intuitions about other agents, whether they're good or bad, intuitions about how decisions ought to be made, about who to blame and who deserves blame, even basic intuitions about whether or not people did something on purpose, intentionality, and whether or not they had control over it, agentic intuitions, and even intuitions about privacy, right, and what it means to be able to have privacy in a social setting. These intuitions, which I'll get to, are stubborn, right? And they can often lead us astray in funny and interesting ways. So let's focus for a second on privacy and intuitions about privacy. These are interesting because they point to a certain kind of failure that we have. For instance, we voluntarily post a ton of information on social media. We carry tracking devices with us at all times in the form of a phone. We are comfortable that in many cities, in some countries, there are cameras that are constantly on and recording our actions. And these cameras are visible and they're surveilling us. So if privacy was really something that we cared about on at a principled level, all of this might bother us. We would not carry the phones that we carry. We wouldn't have devices like Alexa or Siri activated. But those forms of observation, like this surveillance camera here, don't trigger our sense that our privacy is being violated, at least not anywhere near as strongly as some other cues. So what does? The same things that would have triggered that you might be having a violation of privacy 1,000 years ago. If someone stands close to you when you're speaking to a friend, we lower our voice. If someone is staring at us from across the room and you can feel their gaze, That's creepy. We don't like it. We're very sensitive to the presence of others, and we're extremely attuned. There's a lot of good psychological work on this. We're extremely attuned to the eye gaze of others. And so this is why security cameras aren't designed like this, right? If they were, we would immediately have our intuitions sort of spike and give us a warning sign that somebody is looking at us. So you can imagine a city of CCTV cameras, all with these anthropomorphic masks on top of them. People might actually start to feel very differently about being surveilled. Matter of fact, let's look at the example of Google Glass. This was a product released a few years ago, in development for many years at Google. They provided their wearers with heads-up displays of information. Many of you are probably familiar with this. But in many places, these glasses were banned entirely. People felt very uncomfortable with them. And in fact, this is probably a big reason that Google stopped development on these. People had some resistance toward others wearing these glasses. Now, it can't be a coincidence that the cameras were placed so close to the eyes of other individuals. Because after all, we carry cameras around with us at all times, right? We have cameras on our phones. We could have a GoPro around our neck and we could be recording everybody. Chances are it wouldn't raise the same alarms as seeing somebody's eyes with a recording device, because again, we're attuned psychologically to faces, to eyes, to eye gaze. So, intuitions about privacy don't really track privacy well because our intuitions haven't evolved in the situations that we find ourselves in now. There were no cameras, there was no mass surveillance, there weren't recording devices in our pockets and in our living rooms. And because of that, we're fairly inconsistent with our emotional responses to our privacy being violated. Okay, let's turn to what I am really interested in, which is algorithmic decision-making. So algorithmic decision-making is the use of machines to aid in human decisions. Machines can, in a wide variety of cases, make much better decisions than humans. They can work harder, they can work faster, they can work longer than human brains, they can process a lot more information, they're not limited by fatigue, they are not biased as long as they're programmed right. And in fact, a lot of algorithms are making decisions for us every day, at all times, and we have no idea. But they're there making decisions about supply chain distribution, about risk management, about medical diagnoses. Algorithms fly and land thousands of planes every day. Chances are, if you've been on a plane recently, it was landed solely by a computer. And we're content to get directed by algorithms in many aspects of our life, even if we do know that those algorithms are behind the decisions that are being made. So Spotify will suggest songs, algorithms decide what news items we see on Facebook, what products we see on Amazon or Instagram, and even what route we take to work. Now, obviously, some of these algorithms make mistakes. Amazon's suggestions for what I should buy next are often laughable. They tell me to buy the thing that I just bought, and they can make much worse mistakes. But what I want to focus on is the difficulty we have accepting the decision-making of machines, even when we know that those decisions are benefiting us. My worry is that we're foregoing the very real benefits of using these algorithms to optimize decisions across many domains in which a great deal of good can come from turning things over to computers. So, just like intuitions about privacy, we might have certain intuitions about privacy, we also have certain intuitions about computers making decisions for us. And in fact, this is Deep Blue. Just to illustrate, this is the computer that beat Garry Kasparov at chess. Computer much smaller nowadays can do the same thing. There's no shot that a computer won't beat most chess players in the world. But there is something about these algorithms in some cases that really bothers us. And researchers have coined this algorithm aversion or algorithmic aversion. Especially, we are bothered by algorithms that are making decisions that we view as moral in some way or another. We are especially averse to having machines make ethical decisions, even when those decisions can lead to a more positive outcome than any humans making those decisions. For instance, in a recent paper by the psychologist Kurt Gray, he showed that people dislike decisions made autonomously by a computer, not only when they make errors, but even when they lead to a successful medical outcome, or the decisions of a computer, an autonomous computer, when they lead to a successful missile strike, not just when they mess up. When compared to the same decision made by a human, people prefer human decision making. Even when decisions like parole violations are made by a computer, we have deep suspicions of it. Journalists and consumers point to the amount of bias in algorithms, but rarely do they compare it to the amount of bias in human decision making. Right? So this is in the Gray paper, for instance, they had the computer making specific judgments about investment in more moral companies. So even when a computer was allowed to decide to avoid certain kinds of products because they were morally tainted, people just weren't happy with it. They preferred the decision to be made by a human. Again, even if it was the same decision. Same with medical decision making. When it comes to moral medical decision making, when ethics are involved, we're just uncomfortable. Autonomous vehicles, this plays out a lot. There's now a vast literature on autonomous vehicles and ethical decision making. And it just turns out that we're very uncomfortable with our cars having to make judgments about life or death. So just think of, for instance, the amount of media attention that's gained when an autonomous vehicle crashes compared to the amount of media attention that the thousands and thousands of crashes from human drivers gets every day. There is something about turning the control over these decisions to computers that actually makes us uncomfortable. So by now there have been a number of demonstrations that we don't like it if the computer in our car has to decide between, for instance, saving one life and hitting another, if it has to swerve to avoid one person but will inevitably hit another person. For some reason, people prefer that they're the ones making those decisions and reject the computer's decisions. Let me give you another example, one that is actually sort of dear to my heart because of my involvement in some of these institutions that are trying to improve the amount of good done by charitable donations. Effective altruism as a movement just describes a group of people who are looking to maximize the amount of good that they can make with their dollar, with any given dollar. So what they do is they pour through the data across all charities. They have spreadsheets, algorithms that determine what the best use of a dollar is to optimize the amount of good in the world. They're driven by a sort of utilitarian ethic. Let's maximize. Why give your dollar to something that will only help somebody a little bit when you can give a dollar to a charity that will save a life? A lot of people are uncomfortable with this as well. They don't think that these kinds of decisions should be made by a cold and calculating computer. They think that in the domain of charity, you ought to be motivated by compassion and by empathy. In fact, in some studies coming out of our lab, we even show that if a person makes the judgment, much like a computer might, in a very rational, deliberate way, poring over the data, makes a decision to make a charitable donation, People view that as less moral than if people make a decision based on empathy and compassion. People have a real sense, not just of what decision is right, but of how decisions ought to be made. And computers seem to lack the features of decision-making that we value in humans, those warmer, tender emotions that we care about, loyalty, empathy, compassion. As of now, computers can't have that. So people have a distrust of computers in the moral and ethical domain. So, what do we do? What is the solution? Well, if you accept what I'm saying, that there are many ways in which we can optimize and benefit the world through innovative technologies, whether they be in the financial realm, decision-making tools in the financial realm, or in the healthcare realm, or in charitable contributions. If you accept that computers might actually be able to yield better, to come up with better decisions, what can we do to make this easier on our intuitions? What can we do to increase the pace of adoption of these technologies? Well, there are a few things that have been shown, demonstrated by researchers. The biggest one is what we might call a human in the loop. Oh, sorry, this is an example of ethically autonomous robots used in war. People have gotten very, very upset that you might have a robot placed in the middle of a war situation making decisions about right and wrong, somehow missing that humans under those conditions also make very, very bad decisions. Okay, so solutions. The biggest solution, according to the research, is what we might call human in the loop. This is simply inserting a human into the decision-making process at some point. So people are much more comfortable with computers making these decisions if they know that a human being has seen the decision. So inserting them at some point, whether it be supervisory or whether it be just to check the answers. Sorry, my headphones got unplugged, so I'm plugging them back in. That seems to be one solution, right? That's sort of just going back to taking a step back again to embrace our intuitions, inserting somebody there. And this makes sense because one of the features of computer decision-making that bothers individuals is that there is no agent that can be blamed when things go wrong. So if a computer messes up, if your autonomous vehicle gets a blue screen of death and you get in a car accident, you can't shake your fist at the blue screen of death. Who do you blame? Do you blame Elon Musk? Do you blame the programmer? Do you blame that particular version of software that was being used? If you put an agent in the loop, then it gives people somebody to hold accountable. I think more importantly, we should use better design. So a lot of what we seem to be averse when it comes to computer decision-making is that we don't have control over the decisions. That human beings don't have control. Now, again, this is sort of just accepting the inevitable that humans want some control over it. They don't want to turn over decision-making to computers. But what can be done, and what some researchers have shown, is that in the design process of a technology, if you include some bits where the user feels like they have control over the decisions being made, it actually doesn't even have to be real control. It can be just the illusion of control. People are much more likely to adopt those technologies. Design for transparency. One of the issues that we have with algorithmic decision-making is that we often don't know how the decision is being made. This is especially true for machine learning algorithms that essentially are a black box. We don't exactly know how they made the decision, but not all algorithms are like that. And in cases in which there is the ability to describe how the decision is being made, how the algorithm was constructed, people become much more comfortable with adopting the algorithm, and they become much happier with the outcome of optimizing their decision making. Finally, there is something in line with the transparency that is often not communicated, and that is, what are the standards being used to determine that a decision is good, that it's optimal, that it's rational? It's often unclear to people whether there is agreement between them and the decision that the computer is making. So for instance, if you ask an average driver what the right decision for an autonomous vehicle to do is when, say, the car is out of control and about to hit 3 pedestrians, or it can drive off of the bridge and only kill the one driver. In the abstract, people say, yeah, the algorithm should do the greatest good for the greatest number of people and save the 3. But when told that it's their car and they're the driver, they firmly say, no, the right answer is to protect me. It's my car after all. So making clear what the rational standards are and seeing how congruent or incongruent they are with what the human being thinks the correct answer ought to be is a step that we can take in order to make some of these decisions go more smoothly. Okay, I'll end there just with simply saying we could just turn over a ton of our decisions to algorithms, and I think we would probably have a net benefit. But that's not going to happen anytime soon. So in the meantime, what we have to do is find ways to create congruence between these old intuitions that we have about what's right and wrong, what's good and bad, about other agents, and find ways to make us more comfortable with the way the computers are making decisions and make those computers adapt a little bit to our intuitions for now. I'll end there. Thank you very much for your time.
Moving to the open mic session. What a 4-hour, I'm exhausted. I don't know how you're feeling, but there's just so many territories that we covered today, and they weren't, as I promised, skips in the park. These were some tough ground to travel. And when you think of what we've covered over the last 4 hours, and from Kelly's opening remarks, where she really set the stage in terms of launching a movement, scientific process, behavioral economics, not just tackling little things like, can I grow my market share, but really important things like stakeholder capitalism and the climate crisis and this sense of food waste, why people are going hungry. And so what we want to do now is just really bring back 4 of this brain trust together. Kelly's going to join us, Michael, David's, and of course, Nathaniel or Nate. And we're going to just have an open conversation about what's next. And I think we're going to get the 2 of them on the screen. And so, great. David, can you hear me all right? I think he's just coming on.
Yes, I can.
Perfect. Good. Listen, fantastic conversation. If I can, I want to tell you a story and have you just sort of comment on it. I was hosting a global payment conference, and this guy was talking about going back home to his he happened to be doing a thing in Shanghai. He went to visit his parents who lived in a little village in China. As he's walking into their house, he noticed a camera right over their front door. And he just couldn't understand why his parents, who were very simple people, would have this security camera. And he walked in and they explained, well, no, the Chinese government has installed these cameras everywhere. And he said, the look on my face is just, I drained. I couldn't believe that you were under such a privacy attack. And he said, what'd you think about it? And they said, well, actually, we're really happy because there's no longer any crime. So I'm curious from your point of view, as you start thinking about intuition and adopting technology and marching in step with it, is it really going to be due to personalizing the benefits to the individual? And if so, what role can behavioral economics play in moving things forward so that we view those machines and artificial intelligence as an opportunity, as something that can enlighten society versus thrust humans in the dark ages?
Right. I love your example. Oh, my headphones got disconnected again. I love your example because it highlights something that I was trying to say about the driverless car. The deeply different intuitions when the benefit is clearly to me and maybe not to society. So maybe that is one route to have people adopt some of these technologies, to highlight in a selfish way the benefits to them. And I think actually that's how most of these things are marketed. So we have Ring doorbells that we install. I have a Ring doorbell right in my house. I love it because I get to see everything that's going on in my house. I don't like it so much that everybody else has one and that there are probably video records of me walking my dog every single day. That sort of bothers me. So there has to be the right balance, I think, between emphasizing the societal benefit and perhaps emphasizing the selfish benefit, because when sometimes they clash and people are more than willing to actually abandon their personal benefit because they think that it might actually come with some harm. Like I may just not like that there are video records of me walking all through my neighborhood from my neighbors.
Is there an arc, or is there a storyline where people can erase the intuitions of the past and be much more open-minded to the fact that, again, they're not, these machines and artificial intelligence and network of learning aren't necessarily foes, but they can be friends? Is there a way that you approach it from a scientific way, that in a staged approach, or is it all or nothing?
Well, they're hard intuitions to shake, but I do think that one of the best ways to do this is to make these algorithms hidden. I mean, so in some sense, like I was mentioning, there are a ton of ways that algorithms are aiding in our the decisions made by the powers that be all around us. It's really when they become salient to us that we start having a problem. So making them sort of invisible, or making them so innocuous and with such a clear advantage, like Spotify suggesting new playlists for me. The problem is, if we find out that Spotify is selling our data, then those intuitions can kick in, and sure, they can be overridden by just pure reason, but we have a whole body of research in behavioral economics and psychology showing that overriding some of these intuitions with reason is very difficult. And there are individual differences. Some people do it better than others, but it is an uphill battle.
So Kelly, let me go to you for a second, because I'm interested from you, if your firm was brought in and I really wanted to sell a driverless car or my network of learning or this technology, whether it's the audience was a consumer or the employee, how would you approach that problem, knowing that, as David said, that these intuitions are locked, they're almost in prison? How would you open those bars and release consumers so they have much more open-minded towards it?
Yeah, the path to adopting a new technology is not always that straightforward. People are, quick to adopt some technologies that surprise us and slow to adopt others. And we've seen this in different domains. We've seen this in some very important projects, such as a new kind of medical device that transforms the hemodialysis experience. That's for people who have kidney damage or kidney disease and need to receive dialysis on a regular basis. The traditional way of doing that is to go to a clinic, receive your treatment there, and your life is very much imprisoned by that routine. A company has made a very significant investment in a new kind of technology that allows people to do that at home while they sleep, allowing them to travel, to get better outcomes with a device that's kind of the size of a mini fridge. Better outcomes, better longevity, more freedom, not having to go to a clinic. How is this a thing? How is this a problem in terms of that adoption? But that adoption journey is very, very complex. It's not as simple as, hey, this is a better device that's going to improve the quality of your life from day one. And if that is an uphill battle, imagine how complex it is with other things. So our study in this project required us to go underneath the hood of understanding what those points of resistance are. And sometimes it's quite surprising. Sometimes it's just not understanding the perception of how big this device will be in my home. It could be people being afraid of bringing something so medical into their home and not wanting to medicalize their home space. So sometimes the solutions then are nothing to do with technology or education about those outcomes that I was talking about. And it's about making that medicalization of that device seem less intrusive. It starts to be a matter of how do we bring in better, friendlier design around the device, and it becomes aspects of the human psychology to facilitate that adoption. That said, technology can be used for evil purposes. It has to be done for noble reasons. The data transparency, the way that data is being used, the way that technology is being used, can be very dangerous for individuals and for society. So we need to make sure that as citizens, we are pushing back on where technology is being used for the wrong reasons. So that skepticism that we see sometimes, but not other times, that resistance to invasion of privacy or misuse of our data, I think that's another intuition where people are rather misguided. So it's not just about adopting technology always just for the appeal's sake of a particular thing, but patients, citizens, excited enthusiasts of technology always need to make sure that we are understanding the technology, so we're adopting the right technology for the right reasons.
It's interesting. Michael, I want to go to you next if I can. I always sketch out little things. I'm a terrible drawer, but to me, it's just how I really store metaphors. I love what you talked about with the well versus the river. And we went over it so quickly. And I think to me, it really brought to light what you're doing with Q in terms of reimagining the consumer, but more importantly, reimagining the creative process where you're still bringing in the beauty of the art, but with the power of the science. Could you take us a little bit, explain that a little bit more?
Well, the philosophy itself is a philosophy of collaboration. And when I first read the book on Say Katsushar, the metaphor didn't immediately wasn't immediately understandable to me, but essentially it's got a double meaning. If you recall, Tony, when I was explaining about Say Katsushar earlier on, and about how we try and look at people as Say Katsushar rather than as consumers or users, in other words, look at them as human beings, the primary aspect of the philosophy is indeed that you're actually not just speaking to people at a distance and just trying to sell them something. You're actually trying to engage them in something that's going to improve their lives. It's actually a long topic of conversation in its own right, because you can ask yourself the question in certain ways whether people should be, in fact, trying to sell people certain things. I mean, I've recently spent a lot more time in the UK, and I'm very saddened by the amount of betting advertising that's going on. But anyway, so I'm not always saying it's for a good thing. But essentially, the first meaning of Say Katsushar is getting is a proximity to people and looking at them as rounded human beings. But an ancillary aspect of the philosophy is on the creative process. And this is where the well and the river comes in to some degree. The well is essentially just a place, historical Japanese place where in villages people would congregate, just as today people congregate in other places, even in just in kitchens, if it's in the family, or if it's, in the, pre-COVID at least, in pubs or market squares or wherever, and would essentially communicate with one another and create things, whether it's just creating a conversation, whether it's creating something more than that. And so it denotes a collaborative, creative process. The river is essentially the corollary of that, which is if you don't do that, then you're essentially building a barrier between yourself and whoever it is you're actually dealing with, whether it is selling something to that person or whether it's actually trying to communicate with them. And that barrier is often insurmountable insofar as developing a good creative solution, and certainly it's going to be deficient in understanding who it is that you're selling to. So the philosophy is multifaceted, operates at different levels, but it's fundamentally a philosophy of gathering. It's a philosophy of understanding. It's a philosophy of depth. And for all of those reasons, it's a great North Star for any creatively driven enterprise.
And another sort of adjacent question that we talked earlier about Kelly Peters and BEworks and the fact and behavioral economics as being a way to help to validate, legitimize, and as you call it, almost this new creative renaissance, almost the Charlie Saatchi, Margaret Thatcher days, where leaders were in step with people that could creatively animate vision. Do you think that the leaders out there are ready for this? Because it does require a restructuring, a rethinking, and a reimagination, not just in how you see the consumer, but how you see the role of innovation happening within an organization.
I think they are ready for it, but they may not know it. Ultimately, when I've observed a couple of times in my life a really impressive performance by a creative organization. You mentioned Charlie Saatchi. Charlie and Morris and their team in the 1980s did an absolutely phenomenal job at that particular time for the advertising industry. They really did, for a period of time, I would say from around 1980, probably through to the mid-90s, really blaze a trail for the power of creativity and what it could mean to organizations. And it wasn't just advertising, although people remembered Saatchi and Saatchi as it was then, as an advertising agency primarily, but they applied their minds to all sorts of problems that didn't always have an advertising outcome. And we haven't got time to go into the mechanisms that they use, but they were essentially driven by very talented people. I think when one looks at what we're trying to do and the role of BEworks in it, we're trying to do the same thing. I mean, we may not be able to do it with quite the elan of the Saatchi brothers of the 80s, although I think we have some pretty impressive organizations and people. But we're embracing new subjects at Q. We're embracing a different way. And BEworks, which is the leader in behavioral economics, is a part of that particular process, a very, very important part of it. Sometimes a project will need to lead with it and sometimes not. But at the end of the day, it is about providing the reassurance of the quality of thinking that goes into the solutions that we provide. To that degree, we aren't that different to Saatchi and Saatchi of the 1980s. some of what we're doing is similar, some maybe a little bit further away. They weren't promoting behavioral economics back then, but I suspect in their own way, they were doing something that was a good proxy for it. So the answer is yes, it is needed. No, not everybody understands that it's needed.
Thank you. Nate, I want to go to you because if there's an underlying chord that was played throughout today, it was trust. And that, that to get people to believe, to trust, to behave, it's just not waving a magic wand. You've really got to start using a lot of what we talked about today, the scientific process, behavioral economics. You spent a lot of time talking about employees. In your sense, because I think a lot of people are really, we talked about it earlier, but I want to bring this back, are waking up to the reality is things will never be back to normal. People aren't going to come in and march 9 to 5. People aren't going to necessarily look at a career for life. People aren't necessarily going to work full time. All the stuff that was starting to happen as COVID's accelerated. What advice can you give to the people in the audience as they come to terms with it? How do they approach it so that their culture remains vibrant, exciting, purposeful, and a tiebreaker?
I think one of the most important aspects of this is embracing that things never being the same might be a good thing, and welcome the opportunity to reimagine what the future of behavior might look like, and to dig deeply into the insights that we've already amassed from the scientific literature, and to imagine what we might find out tomorrow. If there were one thing that I think we can agree we can trust on is that humans are an incredibly innovative species. When we look at our history, we see massive technological innovation, but we also see the rise and popularization of science itself. So to me, the fact that we have made it to this point using these incredible minds and brains and created such an advanced society tells me that the future of behavior is arguably even more exciting, and the potential that lies before us is incredible.
So Kelly, we started with you this morning, and I want to end with you because early on, I was probably sounded very grandiose to the audience when I said, and I know this because I know you, your eyes are shining, your heart's beating, and you said, I want to create a movement. I'm not here to sell a campaign, or I want us to really put a dent in humanity, a positive dent. How do you feel how today went? And people that leave, if even one person did something different, what would it be tomorrow morning that you would say, again, that was time well spent?
Well, first of all, I hope that they can see that we can transform society and the economy through scientific thinking that's been powered by the rich behavioral insights. I hope that people see that bias plays an invasive role in every decision that we make, but there are ways to kind of root that out to help us get to better decisions. But behavioral economics doesn't stop there. It's not just this whole sort of encyclopedia of biases that you're just sort of confronted with. It's like, that's not the first realization of this field. It's actually recognizing that those very biases can be used to help us. Nate described this as a actually important opportunity for change. And you did that as well earlier when you talked about the pandemic being kind of this disruptive moment. It's about recognizing that there are these moments for change that can happen, and that behavioral economics and scientific thinking actually gives us the tools to drive that change and to measure its impact on the world. That triumvirate, that three-part tool set of behavioral economics, I think, is something that can give us great hope about the scale of the impact that we can have on the world, and that everyone has a role to play in that.
So I want to warn you, in the next 30 seconds, you might find what I'm about to do to be cheesy. But I don't believe it is. I really, when Michael and we talked about the Avengers, we talk about people that really want to make a positive force. I had someone go out and at the break and buy a cape. and they came back with a very gold cape that I want to present to you as the launch of this movement. And I would love this cape to become symbolic that every year you present it to a client that best embodies everything you talked about, whether the bias is to erase biases or to take advantage of biases, but in doing so, to put a beautiful positive dent on humanity. I am so honored to be the host of the first, and let me adorn you with this cape here. I hope I don't ruin your glasses here. There we are. This is the cape of change, and I want clients to be wearing this from here on in because today we launched a movement. Thank you for joining us at BEworks Shaping the Future, and you rock a gold cape.
Awesome. Thank you all so much.